Tour number 3. The man at the back of the second tour was the same man who had been at the back of the first tour 2 hours earlier, and he had not changed his jacket, and he had not tipped at the end of the first one. He was standing behind a couple from St. Louis with his hands in his jacket pockets. He was listening to my opening as if he had not heard it before, which he had. I run the ghost tour for a company that does not need a name. There are 6 of us guides. We work the 7, 9, and 11 slots. The 7 and 9 slots run side by side most nights because the demand is heavy. The 11 slot is the one I work most because the demand is lighter and the tips run higher, since the only people booking an 11 o'clock ghost tour in the French Quarter are people who are drunk enough to want to be scared and sober enough to remember to tip the guide at the end. I had agreed to cover the 9 that night for another guide, Macy, whose daughter had a fever. The man had been on my 7, and now he was on my 9. My name is Cal. I was 28 that fall. I was halfway through a history doctorate at Tulane, writing a dissertation about labor riots in the Reconstruction-era port. The tour job was supposed to pay my rent for the 2 years I had left of coursework and writing. I was making maybe $400 a week on tips and a small base. I lived in a half a shotgun on Bourbon Street that I shared with a roommate named Pell, who was a line cook at a place in the Marigny. I had a girlfriend named Lucia, who was a art teacher at a high school in Algiers, and who took the ferry to come see me 2 nights a week. I had no dog. I had a hot plate and a French press and a stack of books that was taller than the dresser they were stacked next to. The tour route runs about 40 minutes. We meet at the corner of St. Anne and Chartres, across the street from the lower edge of Jackson Square, at the bench where the brass plaque about Bienville is. The guide stands on the curb with a handheld speaker the size of a tall coffee can. The guide gives an opening that includes a story about Andrew Jackson's horse and a story about the cathedral being built 3 times. The group is usually 20 to 30 people. The guide walks the group down Chartres to St. Anne, up St. Anne to Royal, north on Royal to Governor Nichols where the LaLaurie Mansion is, then back down Royal to Pirates Alley, through Pirates Alley to the back of the cathedral and St. Anthony's Garden, around the side of the cathedral to Père Antoine Alley, and back to Jackson Square. The dismissal is at the front of the cathedral. The tip jar comes out at the dismissal. The guide says thank you. The guide hangs around for 5 minutes for questions. The guide walks back to the office on Decatur to drop off the speaker and clock out. If the next tour is yours, you turn around and meet the next group. I knew the tour by heart. I knew it so well I had stopped paying attention to it. I had started paying attention to the people instead. The guide who really listens to a tour group can clock the personalities in the first 3 minutes. The couple from St. Louis who are on their 20th wedding anniversary. The bachelorette party of 7 from Atlanta who have already done 2 daiquiri rounds. The honeymooners from Indiana, the wife of which is much more into it than the husband. The 2 college girls from Tulane who have come on the tour because the boyfriend of one of them is studying for the bar and they are bored. The dad with 2 teenage kids who is trying to give them a vacation experience while their mother is on a work trip. The 4 guys from Houston who are drunk and will spend the tour cracking jokes. The widow from Phoenix on her first solo trip since her husband died. They are all real people. I could name 20 more types. The man at the back of the first tour that night had not fit any of the types. He had not tried to. He had stood at the back of the group. He had not asked any questions. He had not laughed at the jokes. He had not turned to the person next to him to comment on the cathedral. He had not taken any pictures. He had not held a drink. He had stood there with his hands in his jacket pockets, and he had listened, but he had also watched the group, and his watching had been the thing my eye had caught on twice, because guides watch the group too, and a man at the back who watches the group is a man competing with the guide for the same view. He had been maybe 40, light brown hair, regular cut, no beard. He had been about my height, which is 5'11", but heavier, maybe 210. He had been wearing a navy zip-up jacket with a small logo I had not been able to read. He had been wearing khakis and white sneakers. He had had a gray backpack slung over one shoulder. He had had a watch on his right wrist. He had had no wedding ring. He had had a face that was easy to forget, which I am putting in here because I have thought about it a lot, and I am sure he had practiced having that face for a long time. At the dismissal of the first tour, the rest of the group had tipped me and asked questions and stayed for pictures with the Lalaurie Mansion story on their lips. The man at the back had walked away without tipping. He had walked away toward Bourbon, but he had not gone to Bourbon. He had stopped at the corner of Chartres and St. Peter. He had pulled out a phone. He had stood there scrolling. I had not noticed it then. I had been with the rest of the group. What I had noticed, 10 minutes after dismissal, on my way back to the office to drop the speaker, was that one of the college girls from Tulane had broken off from her friend to take a phone call in the doorway of a closed shop on Royal. The friend had walked toward Bourbon and gone into a bar. The college girl had been alone on Royal in the doorway, and there had been a man standing across the street from her, hands in his jacket pockets, watching her. I had not stopped. I had told myself I had been seeing things. I had told myself I had been tired and projecting. I had walked back to the office. I had picked up the speaker for the 9. I had gone back to Jackson Square, and now the same man was on my 9. I will say what I did during that second tour, because I want to be clear that I did not do the right thing right away. I gave the tour. I gave it well. I am a good tour guide. I am a graduate student in history. I know the city. I have my own opinions about Madame Lalaurie, which I keep to myself, and I have my own opinions about Père Antoine, which I also keep to myself, because the people who come on the ghost tour want the ghost tour and not my dissertation. I gave the tour, and I watched the man. He stayed at the back. He watched the group. He did not watch the cathedral when we got to it. He did not watch the Lalaurie Mansion when we got to it. He watched a woman in her late 20s at the front of the group. She was alone. She was wearing a green dress and a denim jacket. She had a small black purse over her shoulder. She was on the tour by herself. I had noticed her at the meeting bench and had been mildly concerned because women alone on the 11 o'clock tour sometimes get followed by drunks who think a woman on a ghost tour is open for company. I had moved her up to the front of the group on the walk because I do that with anyone solo who looks like a target. It is a thing I have learned to do without thinking about it. The man watched her the whole tour. At the dismissal in front of the cathedral, I held the tip jar out. People dropped bills in. The woman in the green dress dropped a folded 20 in and said the tour was great and asked me where she should go for a quiet drink near her hotel, which was on Bienville. I told her about 2 places. She thanked me. The man at the back of the group did not tip. He turned and walked away toward Pirates Alley, which was the back way to where he had gone after the first tour. I had 30 seconds to make a decision. I picked the speaker up. I told the rest of the group I had to go because the office closed at 10:30. I started walking after the woman in the green dress, who was walking toward Chartres. I walked 20 feet behind her. The man at the back of the group had cut through Pirates Alley toward Royal. He was going to come out on Royal Street and walk parallel to her. I caught up to the woman at the corner of Chartres and St. Peter. I said, "Ma'am, I am sorry," from the tour. She said, "Hi." I said, "I am going to sound like I am out of my mind. I do not want to be that. Will you walk with me a minute?" She said, "What?" I said, "There is a man who has been on my last 2 tours. He has not asked questions. He has not tipped. He has watched you the whole second tour. He is walking up Royal right now, parallel to you. I do not know what he is doing. I think he is going to try to talk to you when you get to Bourbon. I do not want him to." She stopped walking. She looked at me. She said, "Are you serious?" I said, "I am serious." She said, "Why are you telling me this?" I said, "Because I would not be able to sleep tonight if I did not." She said, "Okay." She was named Joelle. She was 31. She was from Charleston. She was an emergency room nurse. She was in town for a long weekend by herself because she had needed a long weekend by herself. She told me all this in the next 2 minutes as we walked back toward Jackson Square instead of toward Bourbon. She had a way of asking questions and listening to the answers that made it easy to talk to her. I think it was the nurse in her, Emergency room nurses have a way of de-escalating a stranger's panic, and I had been in a low-grade panic since the moment I had clocked the man on the second tour. She was the one keeping me calm now. I told her my plan, which was that we should walk to the office on Decatur, where I needed to drop the speaker, and from there we should call her a car and get her back to her hotel. She agreed. We walked. We did not see the man. At the office, I dropped the speaker. The night manager, a guy named Royal, who I had worked under for 2 years, looked at Joel and looked at me and said, "What is going on?" I told him. Royal was 60. He had been doing tours and managing tours in the quarter for 40 years. He had seen everything. He listened to me for 90 seconds without interrupting, and at the end of it he said, "We are calling police." He called the 8th District. He gave them my name. He gave them the description. He told them which corner I had last seen the man on, and where the man might be expected to circle back to. He told them the woman was safe in his office. He gave them my cell number. The dispatcher said a unit would come by. Joelle stayed in Royal's office. He gave her a cup of coffee. I went back out onto Decatur to wait for the unit. The cruiser pulled up at 11:40. 2 officers. I described the man. I described what I had seen. The lead officer was a guy named Petrowski, who I would later learn had worked the quarter for 16 years and knew every alley by its bricks. He listened. He said, "You ever seen this guy before today?" I said, "No." He said, "You sure?" I thought about that. I said, "I am not sure. I have seen a lot of people on a lot of tours." He said, "All right, let me ask the other guides." He asked the other guides over the next 24 hours. He got back to me the next afternoon. He said, "Cal, he has been on at least 11 tours over the past month. Different companies, different routes. He has been on the cemetery tour twice. He has been on the voodoo tour 3 times. He has been on your ghost tour at least 4 times. 3 of the guides remember him. One of them, a woman named Macy, remembers him from a Saturday night when he followed one of her tour groups for 2 blocks after dismissal and tried to talk to a woman at the corner of Royal and Conti before she got into a cab. Macy did not file a report because nothing happened." I said, "Macy is the one whose daughter had a fever yesterday." He said, "Yes." I said, "Did you find him?" He said, "Not yet, but we are watching for him." They found him 3 nights later, on a Friday, at 11:15 at night, at the back of a cemetery tour that left from the corner of Basin and Conti. I worked tours each of those 3 nights between. I did not want to. Royal told me I could take the nights off paid. I told him I would rather work. The truth was, I wanted to see if the man would come back, and I wanted to see him from the front of a group again, so I would know what to do this time. I did not say that part to Royal because Royal had been doing this for 40 years and would have heard the part underneath and would have sent me home. Each tour I gave those 3 nights, I clocked the back of the group 3 times in the first 5 minutes. I clocked it twice more before we got to the La Laurie mansion. I clocked it 3 more times between the La Laurie and Pirates Alley. The man was not at any of my tours those 3 nights. I knew that within 90 seconds each time, and I kept looking anyway, because the look had become a tic. I did not yet know how to stop. On the second of those 3 nights, between the 9 and the 11, I sat on the bench at the meeting spot at St. Anne and Chartres in the dark for almost 40 minutes and watched the people of Jackson Square. The bench faces a brass plaque about Bienville. The plaque is at hip height. The brass is dulled. There were 2 men playing chess at the next bench over, with a board they had set up on a pulled-up milk crate. There was a young woman in a hoodie reading a paperback novel under the light of a gas lamp on St. Peter. There was a homeless man named Patches, who I knew by sight pushing a grocery cart full of soft things up Sharp past the square. There was a couple I had married myself the year before at a friend's wedding in Lakeview, walking past arm in arm, who did not see me. The cathedral bells rang the half-hour. A man on a horse-drawn carriage clopped past on Decatur with 3 passengers. The river breeze came up the alley between the cathedral and the Cabildo and brought the smell of the river 2 blocks away. The smell of the river is hard to describe. It is mineral and wet and a little rotten, but the rotten is the rotten of something natural, going back to itself, not the rotten of garbage. It is one of the smells of the city I love most. I sat there and breathed it and watched the people and thought about the man and tried to make a decision about whether to ask Royal for the 11 slot back the next night. I did ask. Royal gave it to me. The man did not come. He came to a cemetery tour the next night instead. The cemetery tour was a different company, called Quarter Walks, run by a woman named Yvette, who had been in the business almost as long as Royal. She had been told by Petrowski to watch for the description. She had been given Petrowski's personal cell number. She had been told that 2 undercover officers would attend the tour. The officers were a man named Garza and a woman named Riley. They posed as a couple from Tulsa on a long weekend. They wore matching Saint sweatshirts they had bought that afternoon at a shop on Decatur because Garza had said the disguise needed to be louder than it felt. They held hands during the meeting brief. They asked the kind of questions tourists ask. They had a handheld tour map they were not following. The man showed up at the meeting spot at 10:50. He stood at the back. He was wearing the same navy zip-up jacket. He had the gray backpack on the same shoulder. He did not tip the guide at the dismissal at the back gate of St. Louis No. 1. He started to walk after a small group of 3 women who had been on the tour together. Garza and Riley stepped in. Riley identified herself first. The man did not run. He looked at them. He looked at the gate of the cemetery behind him, which was closed. He looked at the ground. He put his hands on the iron of the cemetery wall and let Riley put the cuffs on him. In his backpack were 3 rolls of duct tape, a coil of paracord, a folding knife, a small flashlight, a bottle of water, latex gloves, 2 prepaid phones, and a notebook. The notebook had pages and pages of names. Some of the names were guides. My name was in it. Macy's name was in it. 2 of the guides at the cemetery tour company were in it. A guide from a voodoo tour on Decatur was in it. Most of the names, though, were not guides. Most of the names were women he had picked out of tour groups. The names had been written above descriptions. The descriptions had included clothing, hair color, height, accent if he had heard one, and a code that the detective said took them a week to decipher. The code was a number from 1 to 4. The detective said the number was a rating. The rating was based on how easy he had judged it would be to follow the woman after dismissal and how alone she was. He had circled some of the women's descriptions in pen. The circles meant something. The detective said they were not sure what. The detective said the circled descriptions matched, in one case, a woman who had gone missing from a tour in Mobile in 2024. The detective said it matched, in another case, a woman who had been assaulted near the Riverwalk in Memphis in 2023. The detective said he had been moving. He had been working tourist cities. He had been on tours in Charleston and Savannah and St. Augustine, and there had been notebooks like the one we had in his apartment in a long-term rental on Tulane Avenue that had 2 more notebooks in a drawer in the bedroom. He was charged. He took a plea on the New Orleans counts. He was extradited later for the Mobile case and the Memphis case. He is doing a long sentence. I do not remember exactly how long. I have not wanted to look it up. Joelle flew back to Charleston the next day. She sent me an email a week later thanking me. She said she had thought about that night for the whole flight home and for the next 4 nights. She said she had spent the flight running through what would have happened if she had walked to Bourbon. She said she had decided not to keep doing that because the what-ifs were not a useful place to live. She said she had decided to be grateful instead. She said she was buying a small thing for me, which had arrived a week later in the form of a wooden carved owl about the size of my fist, which she said had been made by a woodworker she knew in Charleston, and which I have on the desk where I write the dissertation. She sent me a Christmas card that year with a photograph of her with her dog at a beach. I have not heard from her since. I assume she is well. I hope she is well. Macy quit the tour company 3 months later. She did not say it was because of the man, but I think it was. She moved to a small town in North Louisiana where her sister lived. She works at a library now. She sends a message in our old group chat once in a while to say hello. The first message she sent after she moved said only, "The bench at St. Anne in Chartres, I do not miss it." I had sat on that bench an hour earlier waiting for an 11 slot when her message came in. I had laughed out loud at the timing. The young woman in the hoodie on the next bench had looked at me. Royal is still the night manager at the office. He still works 14-hour days. He still hires every new guide himself by sitting them down at a wooden table in the back office and asking them 3 questions that nobody knows in advance, the answers to which determine whether they get a route. He has not changed. Pell, my roommate, moved out a year later because his line cook job in the Marigny ended, and he moved to Houston for a sous chef job. Lucy and I broke up 6 months after that for reasons that were nothing to do with any of this. She is married to a sculptor now who teaches at the same high school. We are on good terms. I finished my coursework. I am writing the dissertation in slow chunks at a small wooden desk in the bedroom of an apartment off Esplanade. I do not work tours anymore. I left after my 2nd year. The pay had stopped covering rent, and a teaching assistant slot opened up at Tulane that paid better, and I took it. I miss the tour work some nights. I miss the city in it. I do not miss the watching. I learned something about myself in the months after that night with Joelle. I learned that the watching the man had done at the back of my tour was a different watching than the watching I had been doing. He had been watching the group to take from it. I had been watching the group to keep it. I do not say that to make myself sound noble. I had been doing it for 2 years without naming it. The naming was what I had to do after that night. The naming was the part that made the next 2 years of guides I trained in my final months at the company more careful at the meeting bench than I had been. The detective who had handled the case, Petrowski, took me out for coffee at a place on Decatur 3 weeks after the arrest. He had wanted to thank me in person. He had also wanted, I think, to look at me a little. He wanted to see what kind of guide had been the one to make the call. We sat at the counter and drank black coffee, and he ate a bowl of grits. He said, "How did you spot him?" I said, "He was on my last 2 tours." He said, "Yeah, but there are a lot of repeats. Tourists do the tour twice if they like a guide. Locals do the tour for friends. The doubles are not a flag by themselves." And I said, "He did not tip on the first one and came back for the second one." Petrowski said, "There we go." He said, "Cal, you know how many guides have his face in their head right now from one tour and have not flagged him?" I said, "I do not want to know." He said, "Fair enough." He finished the grits. He paid for both coffees. He stood up at the counter and put his hat on, which was a fedora he had been wearing the whole time, and which did not match the rest of his outfit. And he said, "The guides are the line. You know that. Bartenders and pedicab drivers and night auditors and tour guides. Y'all are the line. The fact you do not know it does not change that it is true. The fact some of you do not bother to look does not change it either. We catch what we catch because somebody on the line looks up. You looked up. I will buy you grits any morning of the week." He walked out. He left a $5 tip on the counter, even though I had paid the bill. I do not know if he was a tipper by nature or if he tipped that high because he wanted me to see him tip that high. I have thought about it both ways. What I think about when I think about it, which is less than it was, but more than nothing, is the corner of Chartres and St. Peter. The moment I caught up to Joelle. The moment she stopped walking and looked at me. The way her face did not panic. The way she said, "Are you serious?" and listened to my answer, and made a decision in the space of one breath. I think about the La Laurie mansion balcony, the way it leans a little over Royal, the way I have told the story of the 3rd floor maybe 400 times. I think about Pirates Alley at the back of the cathedral, the gas lamps in the brackets, the smell of old stone, the way a small breeze in there carries the smell of the river 2 blocks away. I think about Macy, her daughter's fever, the Saturday night she did not file a report. I think about the notebook, the names, the code that ranked the women by how alone they were and how easy it would be to follow them after dismissal. I think about the back of a tour group in the half-dark at the edge of a street light on St. Anne. the man with his hands in his jacket pockets. The way I had clocked him without naming it the first night, and the way I almost let him be a normal repeat for that reason on the second. I think about Petrowski's words at the counter. The guides are the line. I think about every tour I gave for 2 years before that night, every group of 20 people, every woman alone at the meeting bench, every face at the back I did not look at long enough. I think about Joelle at the corner of Chartres and St. Peter with her green dress and her denim jacket and her hand half raised toward Bourbon, and the way she lowered her hand and turned with me toward Jackson Square. I think about the man walking up Royal in the dark, parallel to a woman who was no longer walking where he thought she was. The time it took him to figure that out. The corner he must have stopped at, looking back the way she should have come. The way a man stops when a thing he has practiced has not gone how he practiced it. I think about him standing alone at that corner with the dark and the gas lamps and the long stone wall of the cathedral side, the way he might have looked at his watch, the way he might have understood that something was wrong without being able to name it, and the way he must have turned and walked back the way he had come, the way the cathedral bells rang the hour while we were at the office. The way the gas lamp at the end of Pirates Alley was the only light I could see when I walked home that night, after the cruiser had gone and Joelle had gone to her hotel and Royal had locked the office. The way the alley was empty, the way the bells were done, the way the city kept on. The cottage on Ursulines. The lockbox on the front gate took me 4 tries, because my hands were shaking from the second airport coffee, and the code in the message thread had a 0 where I had read an O. By the time the gate finally opened, my brother had unloaded both of his bags onto the sidewalk and was talking to a man with no shirt about a parade. The man with no shirt had a cup of beer in his hand at 10 in the morning and was telling Carter that the parade was on St. Charles, not Ursulines, but you would still hear it if the wind was right. My brother Carter had moved to Houston 8 years before for a job and then a wife and then a baby and then a divorce. He had ended up back in the same job by the time he was 35, a little heavier, a little funnier, a little harder around the eyes. He was getting married again that summer to a woman named Bryn who worked in healthcare consulting and who, by all accounts, was a much better fit than the first one had been. The reunion bachelor something weekend in New Orleans was my idea. The bachelor party itself was supposed to happen in June, in Cabo, with all his guys. This was the soft launch. Just the brothers and one of his old friends, Adrian, who lived in Atlanta and was flying in that night. 3 days. Eat a lot, drink some, walk the quarter, sleep in a real bed in a real city for once. The rental was a Creole cottage on Ursulines 2 blocks off Esplanade. The pictures online had been good. A front room with a fireplace that did not work but looked old in the right way. A bedroom on either side of the front parlor. A small kitchen at the back of the main house that looked out onto a brick courtyard. A second building behind that, 2 stories tall, leaning a little to one side. The listing called the back building the carriage house and said it was owner's storage, not part of the rental. There were photographs of the courtyard with a small wrought iron table and 2 banana trees. There were photographs of the upstairs of the main house, which was a half floor over the back rooms with a low slope ceiling and a single bed called the loft. The loft, the listing said, slept 1. The 2 main bedrooms each slept 2. There was 1 bathroom between the 2 bedrooms. The cottage smelled like cigarettes when I opened the door. It was not strong. It was the smell of a building that had held cigarette smoke in its walls for 50 years and let it out a little at a time when the front door opened in summer. I have a sister-in-law who works in real estate in Mobile, and she has a phrase for that smell. She calls it bones. The bones of the house, she says. Old buildings have bones that smell, and you cannot fix it. You just live with it or you rip the walls out. Carter came in behind me with his bag. He sniffed. He said, "Smokers." I said, "Long ago." He said, "Maybe." The front parlor was as advertised. The fireplace was painted black. There was a leather couch and 2 armchairs and a coffee table with a stack of books that looked like they had been bought in a set at a flea market. The walls had black and white photographs of New Orleans street scenes from the 1940s. The bedrooms each had a double bed and a small chest of drawers and a clothes rack instead of a closet. The bathroom had a clawfoot tub with a curtain hung in a circle around it, and a sink with a rust stain in the basin, and a toilet that ran for 15 seconds every 2 minutes, whether anyone had flushed it or not. There was a small linen closet by the bathroom with extra sheets and towels and a basket of toiletries. The kitchen had a refrigerator from the 1980s that hummed at a pitch that made the teeth ache, and a stove with 2 burners that worked and 2 that did not. There was a card on the counter that said, "Welcome to the cottage. Please be respectful of the neighbors. The courtyard is shared with the carriage house, which is owner storage and is locked. The host is available by message. Enjoy the quarter." The host was not available by message. The host was a woman named Brittany who lived in Portland and had bought the cottage in 2021 as a short-term rental investment. She had a 4.8-star rating on the platform. She had 9 reviews. One of the reviews said the back building was creepy, and the host had answered the review by saying the back building was owner storage and was not part of the rental and was kept locked at all times. Another review said there had been a smell of cigarettes, and the host had answered that smell by saying the cottage had been a smoker's house in the 1960s and the smell could not be fully removed. I had read these reviews on the plane. I had not been concerned. The courtyard was beautiful. That is the first true thing I will say about the cottage. The courtyard had brick laid in a herringbone pattern that had been there long enough that grass grew between the bricks and seams. The banana trees were as tall as the back building. There was a Meyer lemon tree in a clay pot against the wall. The wrought iron table had 2 chairs at it and a third chair stacked on top of the table upside down. The whole courtyard smelled like jasmine because the back wall, the wall that separated the courtyard from the next property over, had jasmine vines climbing all over it. The back of the courtyard was the carriage house, which was a 2-story brick building, maybe 20 feet across, with a downstairs that had a wooden door and an old wooden window with a heavy iron grate over it, and an upstairs that had 2 windows facing the courtyard, both of which had thin curtains pulled across them on the inside. The downstairs door of the carriage house had a padlock on it. The padlock was a master lock, the kind anyone can buy at a hardware store. It was not new. It had been there long enough that rust had bloomed under the shackle. The door itself was warped at the bottom. There was a gap under the door of maybe 2 inches, where someone had stuffed a folded piece of cardboard to keep the cold out or the rain out or something out. I tried to look in the window of the downstairs. The iron grate over the window had a layer of dirt and old spider web on it. The window glass behind the grate was filthy. I could not see anything except my own face reflected in the glass. Carter came up behind me. He said, "Owner storage." I said, "Yeah." He said, "What you think they store?" I said, "Hot sauce, old furniture, Christmas lights." He said, "Bodies." I said, "Carter." He laughed. He was joking the way he had always joked since we were kids. He joked at things that scared him before they could scare him. It was a tic of his. I usually loved it. I did not love it that morning, for reasons I could not name yet. We unpacked. We took the 2 main bedrooms and figured Adrian could have the loft when he got in. Adrian was a small guy, 5'7" and bony. The loft would not fit either of us. Adrian would fit fine. We went out for the day. We had lunch at a place on Decatur that had a po' boy on the menu called the Bachelor's Last Meal. We walked through the French market. We had drinks at a place on Frenchman that was empty at 3 in the afternoon. We came back to the cottage at 6 to nap before Adrian's flight and dinner. Carter slept in his room. I lay on the couch in the front parlor with a paperback and read 3 pages and fell asleep. I woke up to a sound I could not place. It was a soft sound. It was a scrape. It came from above me. The loft was on the other side of the main house, over the back rooms. The front parlor where I had fallen asleep was under the front roofline, which did not have a loft, which had only ceiling joists and roof. There should not have been a sound above me. I sat up. I listened. The toilet did its 15-second hiss in the bathroom. The refrigerator hummed. The fluorescent light over the stove buzzed. Carter snored, faint, through the bedroom door. There was no scrape. I told myself it had been a bird on the roof. Pigeons did not live in the French Quarter so much as they lived above the French Quarter. There were always pigeons. There were always squirrels in the live oaks across the street. There were always rats in the walls. Carter had said something at lunch about rats in the walls because he had seen one in the gutter on Decatur, and that had been part of his joke about bodies in the carriage house. I lay back down. I did not sleep again. I lay there with my eyes open, looking at the cracked plaster on the ceiling. There was a brown stain in one corner, shaped like a paramecium. There was a hairline crack that ran from the center medallion to the wall above the front door. I traced the crack with my eyes. The crack split in two halfway across and then split again, which is how cracks in old plaster do. I was looking at the second crack when I noticed the ceiling medallion was a little off-center. The medallion was the plaster decoration in the middle of the ceiling where you would hang a chandelier in a fancier room, but this room had only a hook with a wire. The medallion was a round disc of plaster about a foot across with grape leaves molded into it. The edge of the medallion was painted the same off-white as the ceiling, but along one part of the edge there was a thin gap, maybe 1/8 of an inch, where the medallion met the ceiling. It was a normal gap. Plaster shifts. Ceilings settle. A gap means the medallion has been there 120 years and the joists have moved. That is what I told myself. I told myself that, and a minute later I told myself it again, and then I got up off the couch and went to the kitchen to start coffee for Adrian when he arrived. Adrian got in at 8. The three of us walked to Frenchman for a real dinner and ended up at a bar that closed at 3. We came back to the cottage at 2-something. Carter and Adrian were drunk. I was not, because I had eased off around midnight when my body started telling me it had been a long day. We laughed at the way Adrian had tried to chat up a woman at the bar who had turned out to be his college girlfriend's younger sister. We laughed at Carter's impression of our father. We turned the front porch light off and locked the gate behind us and went to bed. I lay in my bed in the front bedroom, the one to the right of the parlor, and I listened. The cottage talked. Old houses talk. The wood expanded and contracted with the temperature change. The plaster popped. The refrigerator cycled in the kitchen. The toilet did its 15-second hiss. A streetcar went up Esplanade 2 blocks over. A drunk man laughed at something on the sidewalk outside the gate. A car door slammed. A neighbor's gate creaked. Distant music from somewhere on Bourbon, the way music sounds when it has traveled 4 blocks of brick. I heard the scrape again. It came from above the ceiling of my bedroom. It was not loud. It was a slow drag, like a heavy book sliding off a stack onto a wooden floor. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then it stopped. I sat up. I waited. The cottage talked. The toilet hissed. A neighbor's gate creaked again. The same gate. Maybe a cat. I lay back down. The ceiling medallion in this room was directly over the foot of the bed. I had not noticed it when I lay down. I noticed it now because the streetlight outside the front window cast just enough light through the curtain that I could see the medallion outlined in the gloom. It looked normal. It looked like a medallion. I closed my eyes. There was another sound. Smaller. A breath. The kind of soft exhale you make when you have been holding your breath and you let it out slow. I told myself it was Carter, asleep in the next room. The wall between us was old plaster on lath, which is more or less transparent to sound. I could hear him breathing if I held my own breath. The breath I had just heard was him. It had been him. It had to be. I closed my eyes. I did not sleep for a long time. The next morning was Sunday. We had brunch at a place on Royal that took 2 hours. We walked the quarter. We took Adrian to the LaLaurie mansion, because he was the kind of guy who liked spooky things. We stood in front of the mansion, while a tour guide and a group of 40 tourists in front of us told the story I had heard 4 times in 3 days. Adrian was satisfied. We had drinks at a place near Jackson Square. We came back to the cottage at 5 to take an early dinner break and change shirts before going out for the night. When I walked into my bedroom to change my shirt, I noticed the drawer of the chest of drawers was open. Not wide open, open maybe 1.5 inches. I had used the chest of drawers that morning to put my socks and underwear in. I had closed the drawer. I always closed drawers all the way, because I had grown up in a house where my father had been a kicker if you left a drawer open and tripped him on it, and the habit had stuck. I stood there. I looked at the drawer. I told myself I had not closed it all the way that morning. I told myself I had been hung over and rushed because Carter had been calling me from the front room. I told myself the drawer had slipped open on its own because the floor of the cottage was not level and the drawer was old and the front of the chest was crooked. All of those things were possible. All of those things were also true of the cottage. The floor was not level. The chest was old. I could have rushed. I closed the drawer. I did not say anything to Carter. I changed my shirt. I went to put my wallet back in my bag and I noticed the bag was zipped to a different point than I had left it. Maybe. I was not sure now. I had left it on the chair in the corner, and I always zipped my bag all the way to the strap because I had been on a flight one time where the bag had fallen out of the overhead bin and dumped everything on a stranger, and the habit had stuck. The bag was zipped to maybe 4 inches short of the strap. The strap was facing the other way too. Maybe. I am not a paranoid person. I have a job in supply chain consulting. I am, by temperament, a man who looks at evidence and lets it argue for itself. I looked at the bag. I looked at the drawer. I looked at the ceiling. I told Carter when he came in from his room. "Did you go into my room today?" He said, "No. Why?" I said, "Drawer was open." He said, "Bro. Old house, floor's crooked. The medallion in my room is hanging at an angle." I said, "Did you check your stuff?" He said, "No. Why would I check my stuff?" I said, "Check it." He went into his room. He came back a minute later. He said, "My bag zipped. Drawer's closed. Nothing's missing. The cat doesn't have my watch." I said, "I'm not joking." He said, "I know. I'm telling you, man. It's fine." I let it go. We went out for dinner. We came back at 12:30. Adrian wanted to drink more in the courtyard. We sat at the wrought iron table with 3 beers and looked up at the sky, which had no stars because there was too much light in the quarter to see them. The banana trees rustled when a wind came down the alley between the cottage and the next building over. The carriage house at the back of the courtyard was dark. Both upstairs windows had their thin curtains drawn. There was no light on inside. Adrian said, "What's in there?" Carter said, "Storage." Adrian said, "What kind?" Carter said, "Bodies." Adrian laughed. Carter laughed. I did not. Adrian said, "I'm going up there, just to look." I said, "It's owner storage. We're not allowed." Adrian said, "Owner storage in a building behind a rental. Come on." He walked over to the downstairs door of the carriage house. He pulled on the padlock. The padlock did not move. He tried to peer through the window. He could not see anything. He came back to the table. He said, "I bet she has a meth lab in there." Carter laughed. I sat with my beer in my hand and looked up at the upstairs window of the carriage house. The window on the left was a black square behind the thin curtain. The window on the right was a black square behind the thin curtain. The curtain on the left moved. It was a small movement. It was the kind of movement a curtain makes when air conditioning kicks on in a closed room. The right curtain did not move, only the left. There was no air conditioning unit visible in the carriage house. There were no vents I could see. The building was an old brick structure that probably had window units in the summer that had been pulled for the winter. I said, "Carter." He said, "Yeah." I said, "Did you see that?" He said, "See what?" I said, "The curtain." Carter looked up at the upstairs window. The curtain was not moving anymore. Both windows were still and dark. He said, "It's a breeze." I said, "There is no breeze." He said, "Brother, we're 3 beers in. The banana trees are moving. There's a breeze." I looked at the banana trees. The banana trees were still. I did not say anything else. We finished the beers. We went inside. We locked the back door, which had a deadbolt and a chain. We locked the front door of the cottage, which had a deadbolt and a regular knob lock. We locked the front gate, which had a padlock on it that the host kept locked all the time. We turned off the porch light. We went to bed. I lay in the bed in my room, and I listened. For a long time there was nothing. There was the cottage talking. There was the toilet. There was Carter, very faintly snoring through the wall. There was Adrian, somewhere up in the loft, who I could not hear at all. Then I heard the floor above me creak. The loft was on the other side of the cottage from my bedroom. The loft was over the kitchen and the back hallway. My bedroom was at the front. There was no floor above my bedroom. There was attic. There was roof. I sat up in bed. I held very still. I heard it again. A slow shift of weight, not in the loft. Above me, above the ceiling of my bedroom, above the medallion at the foot of my bed. There was a person in the attic. I will say, because it is true, and because the only way to honor what happened is to say it cleanly, that I sat there for maybe 40 seconds and did not move because I did not believe it, not in the religious sense, not in the I am a rational man sense. I did not believe it the way you do not believe a sound has come from the place a sound has just come from, because your brain refuses to accept that the sound has happened until it happens again, and even then it offers you 3 other explanations before it lets you accept what it was. The sound happened again. A slow shift of weight, then a soft, wet cough. It was a small cough. It was the kind of cough you do when you do not want to be heard coughing. It was muffled, like a cough into a folded sleeve. I got out of the bed without making the bed springs creak, which I had practiced as a teenager sneaking out of the house, and which my body still knew how to do. I grabbed my phone off the nightstand. I went out of my room into the front parlor. The parlor was dark. The streetlight outside threw a stripe of yellow across the rug. The leather couch was a dark hulk against the wall. I went to Carter's door and opened it very slowly. He was face down in his pillow, breathing hard. I crossed the room. I put my hand on his shoulder. I leaned down and I said into his ear, soft as I could, "Carter, do not yell. There is someone in the attic." He came up fast. He did not yell. He has woken up 100 times to a sick kid or a sick wife or a phone call that was bad news. He came up at the speed of a man who has been woken up to bad news before. He did not say anything. He looked at me. I said, "Soft. Get Adrian. Quiet." He nodded. We went out into the parlor and across to the back hallway and up the narrow stairs to the loft. The stairs creaked. I had not noticed before how much the stairs creaked. Every step was a sound. Carter went up 2 stairs at a time on the side near the wall to minimize it. I followed. The loft was a low room with a slanted ceiling. Adrian was sleeping on the single bed under a window. We woke him. He came up grumpy. Carter put a hand over his mouth and said into his ear what I had said. Adrian's eyes went round. He did not yell. The 3 of us went back down the stairs to the parlor. We stood in a tight cluster in the middle of the rug under the medallion. I whispered the plan. The plan was simple. We were going out the front door. We were taking nothing but my phone. We were going to call 911 from the sidewalk. We were not going to engage. We were going to leave. Carter said, "What about my wallet?" I said, "Leave it." Adrian said, "What about my phone?" I said, "Leave it. We can replace your phone. Let's go." We moved to the front door. I unbolted the deadbolt. The deadbolt made a soft clack. Above us, in the ceiling, I heard the slow shift of weight again. Whoever was in the attic had heard the deadbolt. We did not wait to see what happened next. I pulled the door open. We went out onto the front porch and across to the gate. The gate was locked. The padlock was on the inside of the gate. I fumbled the combination with shaking hands. Adrian got it open. We were on the sidewalk on Ursulines Street in our pajamas at 1:50 in the morning. 3 grown men, one of them barefoot. I called 911. The dispatcher answered on one ring. I gave the address. I told her there was a person in the attic of the rental we were staying in. I told her we were on the sidewalk. She said a unit was coming. She said, "Stay on the line." She said, "Do not go back inside." We did not go back inside. We walked to the corner of Ursulines and Burgundy. We stood under the street light there. There was an all-night convenience store across the street that had a man in the doorway who watched us for a minute and then went back inside. There was a couple walking a small dog up Ursulines who passed us and asked if we needed help, and we said we were fine, the police were coming. The woman of the couple said something I have remembered, which was, "The carriage house." I said, "What?" She said, "The back building." I said, "What about it?" She said, "There has been someone in that building for months. I have seen the light on at 3 in the morning. The host doesn't know." I asked her if she had told the host. She said she had tried. She had sent a message through the rental platform. The host had answered that the back building was owner storage and was kept locked. The woman had said she lived next door and that the light came on at strange hours. The host had said the lights were on timers for security. The woman had said the lights came on only sometimes and only late, and that did not seem like a timer. The host had not responded to that. The woman said her name was Marie. She said she had lived next door for 19 years. She said the host had bought the place during the pandemic and had never been to it in person that Marie knew of. The first NOPD cruiser pulled up at 1:58. 2 officers. We told them the story. They listened. The lead officer was a woman, maybe 40, with a calm face. She said, "We are going to clear the cottage, and then we are going to clear the back building. You 3 stay out here with Officer Romaine." They went in. There was a second cruiser pulling up as they went in. Marie stayed with us on the corner. Her husband had come out of their house and was watching from their porch. The dog was at his feet now. The officers cleared the cottage first. They came out the side gate to the courtyard. We could hear them yelling at someone inside the carriage house through the iron-grated window. There were 2 cruisers now and a third coming, and an unmarked Suburban that pulled up behind the second cruiser. I do not know exactly what happened in the back building because I was not in there. The officers told me later. I will say what they told me. The downstairs of the carriage house had been used as a workshop years ago and was full of broken-down furniture, paint cans, a sawhorse, a stack of old shutters, and a tarp covering a hole in the floor where a workbench had been removed. The tarp covered access to a small cistern under the back building, which was old enough that it did not hold water anymore and was dry. The cistern was not where the person had been. The cistern was where some of his things had been. The upstairs of the carriage house had 2 rooms. The smaller back room was full of more storage, including a stack of plastic bins labeled with the host's name. The front room, which had the 2 windows facing the courtyard, had been set up as a living space. There was a mattress on the floor. There was a wall of clothing hanging from a pipe. There was a hot plate plugged into an extension cord that ran out a hole drilled through the wall down to an exterior outlet on the main cottage. There was a small portable refrigerator. There was a battery-powered fan. There was a stack of books on a milk crate. There were 2 prepaid phones. There was a folding chair set up in front of the left window, the one whose curtain had moved. The chair had a worn spot on the seat. I had heard the detective on the first story say that phrase, "worn spot on the seat." I did not learn until later that I would think about a similar chair in a similar back room 100 times over the next 2 years. The man was not in the carriage house when police entered. He had heard us leave the cottage. He had heard the deadbolt. He had heard us on the sidewalk. He had gone out a back window of the carriage house onto the roof of the storage shed next door, which connected to a brick wall that ran along the alley behind the property. He had gone over the wall. He had been on Burgundy by the time we were at the corner of Ursulines and Burgundy. He had walked past us. None of us had noticed. The lead officer who came back out to me on the sidewalk said, "There is an access from the upstairs of the back building to the attic of the main house." He cut it through a shared wall. He could move between the 2 buildings. He could come down into the cottage through a ceiling hatch in your linen closet. I had not noticed the ceiling hatch in the linen closet. I had taken a hand towel out of the linen closet that morning. I had pulled the towel from the 3rd shelf. I had stood at the door of the linen closet for 5 seconds. The officer said he had 3 small access points to look down into your rooms. 2 were through the air return vents. 1 was through the ceiling medallion in your bedroom. He could pop the medallion. I am writing what she said as cleanly as I can. I am not editorializing what she said. I am laying her words down for what they were. He could pop the medallion. He had been popping the medallion for 2 nights to look at me. Marie made us coffee at her kitchen table at 3 in the morning. We sat at her kitchen table in our pajamas. Carter was crying. Adrian was rubbing his face. I was not anything yet. I was empty. Marie said, "How long was he there?" The officer who came back to check on us at 4 in the morning said the squatter had been in the back building for at least 6 months. He was a former handyman for the host who had worked on the place during a renovation in 2024 and had been let go for unrelated reasons. He had a key to the front gate from his time as the handyman. He had cut access to the main house attic himself with a saw over a series of nights when the house had been empty between bookings. The host had not been to the property in 2 years. The property managers who handled cleaning had not noticed the access points because they were small and behind plaster and only visible if you knew where to look. The handyman had been hiding the access points with patches of plaster he made himself. The handyman was arrested 2 days later in a vacant rental property in the Bywater. Cleaners had noticed food wrappers under a kitchen sink. He had been in that house too. He was charged with multiple counts of burglary and stalking and trespassing and unlawful surveillance and theft. He had been moving between vacant rentals around the Quarter and the Marigny and the Bywater for almost 2 years. He was also charged with 1 count related to a woman who had stayed at our cottage 3 months before us. The woman had reported a robbery. The platform had refunded her booking. The host had said the woman was a scammer. The woman had been telling the truth. He had taken her wedding ring from her bag on her second night. She had not even noticed for a week, because she did not wear the ring on the trip. Brittany, the host, messaged me the next afternoon. She said she was so sorry. She said she had no idea. She said the property manager had assured her the back building was secure. She said she would refund us in full. She said she hoped. I understood she was a victim too. She said she hoped this would not affect the review. I did not respond to her message for 3 days. When I responded, I said, "You should sell the cottage to someone who lives in the city." She said she was sorry I felt that way. She left the listing up. The cottage on Ursulines is still for rent. I checked last month. The reviews from after our stay have been deleted by the platform. Carter and Bryn got married that June. The wedding was at a vineyard in Texas. Adrian was a groomsman. I was the best man. I made it through the speech. Nobody at the wedding knew about the cottage, except Bryn. She had insisted Carter tell her, and he had, and she had cried, and they had gone to therapy together for it because she was a smart woman who knew her husband had been almost something he could not name. I have not stayed in a short-term rental since. I do not know if I ever will. I stay in chain hotels with key cards and electronic locks and front desks, with people behind them at all hours. I do not let it bother me. What I think about when I think about it is the medallion at the foot of the bed, the grape leaves molded into the plaster, the small gap along one part of the edge where I told myself the house had settled. I think about the breath I heard the first night and told myself was Carter through the wall. I think about Marie's face under the street light at the corner of Ursulines and Burgundy when she said, "There has been someone in that building for months." I think about a man in the alley behind the property at 2 in the morning, going over a brick wall while we stood at the corner of Ursulines and Burgundy waiting for police, and walking past us on Burgundy in the dark, and looking at the back of our heads, while a young couple with a dog asked us if we needed help. He looked at the back of our heads. He walked past us. Nobody saw him go. Last fair on Decatur, the man flagged me from the curb in front of the old Absinthe house at 3:10 in the morning. He held up 2 fingers in one hand and appealed 20 in the other so I could see them both. The second man came around the corner from Bienville carrying a woman by the armpits like she was a sack of mail. I was on my last fare of the night, except there was no fare on the cab. I had been parked at the stand at the corner of Bourbon and Bienville for almost 40 minutes drinking flat Coke from a bottle I had been working on since Frenchman Street and trying to decide whether to do one more loop or call it. My legs were done. The battery on the cab said 2 bars, which on a cold night with the assist running could be 20 minutes or could be 5. I had not eaten since the gyro at midnight. My phone was at 12% because I had been streaming a Cowboy Junkies album to a Bluetooth speaker clipped to the seat post, and even with the speaker turned all the way down so the riders could not hear it, the battery had been giving up since 2. I had pulled out my charger to plug into the cab's auxiliary when the first man waved at me. I had not looked at him long. I had looked at him long enough to clock the cap and the build and the hand with the 20, and to make a decision in the part of my brain that runs ahead of my conscious mind that this was a normal fare in a town that does not have normal fares after 2 in the morning. Then the second man came around the corner with a woman, and the part of my brain that had cleared him for a normal fare took 2 steps backward. My name is Cole. I was 28 that fall. I had been driving a pedicab in New Orleans for almost 3 years. Before that, I had been driving a pedicab in Austin for a year, and before that, I had been in graduate school in Memphis until I had run out of money. I am a bass player. That is the part of myself I would have given you if you asked me at a party. I played bass in a 4-piece outfit called the East Bank Saints that gigged at a Bywater bar named Bacchanal on Wednesdays and a Marigny place on Sundays and whatever else we could get on weekends. The bass paid me maybe $400 a month if I was lucky. The pedicab paid me the rest. Some weeks the pedicab paid better than others. Some weeks I came home with $200 cash and a wad of dirty fives. Some weeks I came home with 60 and a strained hamstring. I lived in the Bywater in a shotgun rental with 2 roommates and a dog named Carl, who was the dog of one of the roommates but who slept in my room because my bed was on the floor and was easier to climb onto. My girlfriend was a woman named Lacey who worked at a coffee place on Magazine Street and lived with her own roommate in a duplex off St. Charles. We saw each other when we could, which was less than we wanted. We were good together. We were going to figure it out. The pedicab stand at Bourbon and Bienville is unofficial. There is no sign for it. It is a thing the drivers worked out among ourselves over the years. The official stands were at Jackson Square and Frenchman and along Decatur near the French Market, but the corner at Bienville was good because the old Absinthe House dumped drunks until late, and the hotel in the corner needed cabs, and the Bourbon Street walking crowd that was not ready to go to Frenchman would sometimes flag you down for a loop. I had taken a fare from that exact stand maybe 200 times in 3 years. When I saw the second man with the woman, I did not move from the seat of the cab. I left the bottle of Coke where it was wedged. I closed the lid of my phone case so the screen would not glare. The first man walked up to the cab. He was tall, maybe 6'1". He had a gray hoodie under a navy windbreaker, jeans, white sneakers. His hair was cut short. He had a beard that was patchy along the jaw like he had grown it in the last 2 months. The 20 was peeled and held in his right hand. His left hand was in his pocket. He was not drunk. That was the first thing I noticed. Everyone who flagged a pedicab in front of the Absinthe House at 3 in the morning was drunk. He was not. He said, "Hey man, you available?" I said, "Always." "Where to?" He said, "My girlfriend over there got a little too much. We're trying to get her back to the rental." The second man was halfway to the cab by then. He had the woman's right arm draped over his shoulder. His other arm was around her back, holding her up by her waist. Her feet were dragging. She was wearing one shoe. The other foot had a wadded napkin stuck to the heel. Her head was leaned against the second man's shoulder, and her eyes were open, but they were not focusing on anything. Her mouth was open. There was a string of saliva from her lower lip to the front of the second man's coat. He did not seem to notice it. She was wearing a black dress with thin straps. The straps had slid off both shoulders. The neckline was too low for the cold. Her arms had goosebumps. She was maybe 25, maybe 23. I am not good at ages. She had no purse, no phone visible, no jacket, no clutch, nothing on her except the dress and the one shoe. The first man said, "We are at the place on Toulouse, 612 Toulouse. You know it." I said, "I know that block." He said, "Yeah. Can you do that?" I looked at the woman. The second man was angling her toward the cab seat. The cab seat is a bench wide enough for 2 adults sitting close. The cab has a thin lap belt across it that no rider has ever buckled in my 3 years of driving. The second man was about to drop her onto the seat. I said, "Hold on, brother. Let me look at her." The first man said, "She is just real drunk. She got into the daiquiris." I said, "What's her name?" He paused. I clocked the pause. It was maybe half a second. It was longer than it should have been. He said, "Madeline." The second man, who had been getting her into the seat, said at the same time, "Madison." The two of them looked at each other. The first man said, "Maddie. She goes by Maddie. We've been calling her Madison all night because of the song." I said, "What song?" He said, "The Madison song." He was not lying smoothly. He was lying like a man making it up at the speed of the conversation, and that was the second thing I noticed. The first thing had been the pause. The second thing was that there is no Madison song that two drunk friends call a woman by all night. The second man got her seated. Her head fell forward. He put a hand under her chin and pushed her head back, so she was leaning on the back of the seat. He kept his hand there a second. Her eyes did not change. They were open, and they were looking up, and they were not seeing the cab roof. They were seeing somewhere else. I said, "Has she been to a doctor?" The first man said, "She's fine. She's just drunk." I said, "Has she been throwing up?" He said, "Once. Earlier." I said, "What did she drink?" He said, "Hand grenades. Daiquiris. Some shots." I said, "You at the Absinthe House?" He said, "Yeah, earlier. We've been a bunch of places." I said, "I bet." I was stalling. I was stalling on purpose. I needed to see the second man's face. He had been keeping his head down. He had a black ball cap on. The cap had no logo. His coat was a heavy brown jacket. His hands had gloves on. It was 62 degrees that night. I had checked the forecast app on my phone before I started the shift, because pedicab driving is one of those jobs where you check the forecast every 2 hours and the forecast has been wrong every time. 62 is not glove weather. The second man finally looked at me. He had a wide face, light eyes, a scar above his upper lip that ran into his nose. He did not smile. He did not look angry. He looked at me the way a man looks at a parking spot he wants to take. He said, "We good then?" I said, 6:12 to lose. He said, "Right." I said, "That building is closed up. The first floor is. There's been work going on for a year. The whole front is plywood." He said, "We're on the second floor. The entrance is around the back, off the courtyard. The Airbnb has a side gate on the alley." He had an answer. He had an answer for every question. The first man had been hesitant. The second man was not. The second man had thought this through more than the first. I said, "Sure." I leaned forward in the seat. I tapped the meter screen on the handlebar console. The screen showed a low battery icon I had been pretending was not there for an hour. I said, "I got a problem. My battery is shot. I can do Toulouse, but I'm going to have to pedal it without the assist. You ever ridden a pedicab without the assist?" The first man said, "Just go." I said, "I just want you to know what you're paying for. The trip's going to take like 15 minutes instead of 7. The cold's going to suck on her." The first man said, "It's fine." I said, "Tell you what. I'll plug in real quick on the auxiliary. 2 minutes. We'll have enough for the assist." "Cool." He looked at the second man. The second man looked at the cab seat. The woman's eyes had closed and her head had slumped forward again. The second man pushed her head back up against the seat. She made a sound. It was not a word. It was a sound a person makes when their body knows something is wrong and their mind has been turned down too low to do anything about it. The first man said, "How long?" I said, "Couple minutes. There's a power outlet on this side of the building. Hotel lets us use it." There was no power outlet on the side of the building that the hotel let us use. There were power outlets in the lobby of the hotel that the hotel did not want us touching. But I had to buy time, and that was the thing I could think of. I got off the seat. I pulled my charge cable out of my bag. I walked around to the cab side near the brick wall. I pretended to plug into a junction box that was actually an old gas meter. I stood there a second looking at the meter like I was watching for a light. I took my phone out of my back pocket. I held it down by my hip so the screen would not glow up at the men. I dialed 911. The dispatcher picked up after one ring. I knew her voice was going to come out of the phone speaker loud the second she said hello, so I did not put the phone to my ear. I tapped the speaker off. I held it down by my thigh and bent over the meter like I was reading a number. I said in a voice low and tight. "I am a pedicab driver at Bourbon and Bienville. 2 men just put an unconscious woman in my cab. They do not know her name. I am stalling for time. Send a unit fast." The dispatcher said something quiet back. I do not know what. I could not put the phone to my ear without being seen. I had to trust she had heard me. I left the line open and slid the phone into my front jacket pocket so the mic faced up and the screen faced my chest. I stood up. I walked back around the cab. The second man was watching me. He said, "Got a charge?" I said, "Yeah, got a little. Should hold the assist most of the way." I got onto the seat. I clicked the throttle to the lowest setting. I did not start moving. The brake was set. The first man said, "Let's go." I said, "Yeah. Just need to log the fare." I tapped at the meter screen. The meter was a dummy unit. It did not log fares. It looked like it did. I knew it did not. The first man stepped closer to the cab. He said, "Why are you stalling?" I said, "I'm not. App's slow." He said, "Go." I said, "Yep, 1 sec." The second man stepped around to my left side. He put a hand on the handlebar. He said, "Get off." I said, "What?" He said, "I'll pedal. Get off." I said, "Buddy, that's not how this works." He said, "Get off the bike." His hand was still on the handlebar. His other hand was at his side. I could not see what was in his other hand. I could see that the glove on his other hand had something gripped inside it. I said, all right, easy." I lifted off the seat. I put 1 foot down on the ground. I kept the other foot on the pedal. I did not turn my back to him. I stepped away from the bike, slowly. The first man had walked around to the cab seat. He was now leaning over the woman, lifting her chin up. He was looking down the block to see if anyone was coming. I said, loud, in the direction of my chest pocket, 3 of us at Bourbon and Bienville. Pedicab. The 2 men are trying to take the cab and the woman. The first man's head snapped up. He looked at me. He looked at my chest pocket. He saw the wire of the earbuds I had run up through my coat and tucked behind my collar, which were not connected to the phone. He saw the phone shape under the fabric. He said, "He's on the phone." The second man let go of the handlebar. He moved toward me. He was fast. He was faster than a man should be at 3 in the morning carrying a glove with weight in it. I did the only thing I could think of, which was scream. I screamed long and loud and pointed at the second man and screamed again, and the first scream had words in it and the second scream did not. The words in the first scream were, "He's trying to take her. Help, he's trying to take her." There were people in the quarter at 3 in the morning, even on a Wednesday. There was a couple coming out of a bar 2 doors down from the Absinthe House. There was a man unloading produce at the back of a restaurant 50 feet up Bienville from one of the loading bays they use behind the kitchens. There was a mule carriage parked at the curb across Bourbon at the Royal Sonesta, the driver dozing in the seat. There was a woman jogging up the sidewalk in a reflective vest, which I noticed because nobody jogs in the quarter, and I had a half-second to be confused about it. There was another pedicab driver, a guy I knew named Finn, who was rolling up Bienville with a fare in the back, a fare who was a tourist in a Saints jersey, laughing at something on his phone. Everyone heard me. The second man froze a second. That second was enough. Finn slammed his brake and dumped his fare half off the seat and came across Bienville at me on foot in 3 steps. The mule carriage driver woke up and started yelling for police. The man unloading produce dropped a crate of green peppers, and the peppers rolled into the gutter. The jogger pulled out her phone and started filming and shouted she had called police. The second man went for the woman in the seat. He was going to drag her back out of the cab and run. The first man was going to help him. I had the bike. The bike was the only thing I had. I grabbed the handlebar, and I yanked the front wheel sideways, and I shoved the whole pedicab toward them as hard as I could. The cab is not light. The cab with 2 pedals locked is heavy. The bike rolled forward maybe 4 feet, and the side of it caught the first man at the hip and pinned him against the brick wall. He yelled. The second man tried to push past the cab to reach the woman in the seat, and the cab seat post hit his thigh and knocked him off balance. Finn was on the second man by then. Finn is a wiry guy, maybe 150 soaking wet, but he is the kind of guy who has been in 100 bar fights and never lost any of them on time. He hit the second man in the throat with the side of his hand, and the second man went to one knee. The first man tried to twist free of the cab, but his belt was caught on the brake lever. He was yelling. The mule carriage driver was sprinting across Bourbon with a wooden whip in his hand. The man with the peppers had grabbed an empty crate and was holding it like a shield. The second man got back up. He had something in his hand now, the thing that had been in the glove. It was a plastic syringe with a needle on it. The cap was off. He pointed it at Finn and slashed. Finn pulled back and the needle missed him. The second man turned and ran toward Royal Street. He did not get far. The jogger in the reflective vest tackled him at the corner of Royal and Bienville. She was small. She took him down clean at the knees. She was not a jogger. She was an off-duty corrections officer who lived in the Marigny and ran the river loop at 3 because she worked first shift at the jail. I learned all of that later. The first man tried to push the cab off himself with both hands. I held it pinned. He swung at me twice. I kept my head down and my shoulders against the seat and pushed. The mule carriage driver got there with the whip and laid it across the first man's back once, and the first man stopped swinging and curled up. The woman in the cab seat had not moved. I took my phone out of my pocket. The line was still open. I said, "They're down. Tell the units we have an unconscious female in the cab. She needs medical." The dispatcher's voice came back. She said units were on scene. I could hear sirens then. They had been there for the back half of all of this. I had not noticed. The first unit pulled up on Bourbon 30 seconds later. 2 officers came out. One went for the man pinned by the cab. One came to the cab. He looked at the woman in the seat. He felt her neck. He said into his radio, "Get medical here right now." The second man, the one the jogger had taken down, was being held on the sidewalk by the jogger and the produce guy until the second unit came. The third unit took the first man off my cab. I let the handlebar go, and the cab rolled back a foot, and the first man slid to the sidewalk. They sat him up against the wall and cuffed him. The medical bus came in maybe 4 minutes. They put the woman on a board and rolled her into the back. She was breathing. Her eyes were closed. Her lips were turning blue. One of the medics said something about Narcan, and they gave her something through her nose, and her breathing came back stronger. She did not wake up there on the street. She did not wake up for almost 2 hours in the emergency room at University Medical Center. Her name was Sarah. She was 24. She was from Round Rock, Texas. She was in town for a friend's bachelorette party. She had gone to the Absinthe House with 3 friends. Her friends had lost her around midnight when she said she was going to the bathroom. The friends had been looking for her for almost 3 hours. They had been at the 8th District Precinct on Royal trying to file a missing person report when the dispatcher's call came over the radio, and one of the officers there walked it back to them in person. The men were not from New Orleans. They were not from Texas either. They were brothers. One was 41, one was 36. Their last names were the same. They had grown up in a town in southern Mississippi. They had records in 3 states. They had been working tourist cities for years. They had a routine. One brother would slip something into a drink in a bar that ran heavy on tourists. The other brother would wait outside. They would walk the woman out as a sick friend or a drunk girlfriend or a sister who had had too much, and they would put her in a ride share or a pedicab or a regular cab driven by someone they had paid for the night, and they would take her to a place they had rented under a fake name. The place was rarely on Toulouse. The place was usually further out, on Esplanade Ridge, or near City Park, or in Algiers. The Toulouse address had been a thing they told a cab driver when they were close to the quarter. A cab driver would not know it was wrong if they did not know the block. I knew the block. That is how I caught them. The detective who took my statement that night was a woman named Detective Holcomb. She had worked the Special Victims Unit for 9 years before she had been promoted to a coordinating detective role. She said the brothers were responsible for at least 4 women across 3 states that they had been able to tie to them so far. 2 of those women had been found alive. two had not. She did not give me details. She said it would be on me one day, in the back of my mind, if she did. She said something else. She said, "What made you stall?" I said, "The name." She said, "What about it?" I said. She paused. Then she said Madeline. The other one said Madison. They tried to fix it. That fixed it for me. She said, "Most people would not have caught that." I said, "I was already looking." She said, "Why were you looking?" I thought about that. I am still thinking about it. I do not know if I have a clean answer. I said, "She had one shoe." I will say what was in the second man's coat pockets because Detective Holcomb told me. She told me because she said I had earned it. In his coat were 3 more capped syringes, 2 small bottles of a liquid that the lab identified later as gamma hydroxybutyrate, a roll of duct tape, a fold of paracord, a folding knife, a pair of latex gloves, a small flashlight, and a piece of paper. The piece of paper was a map. The map had been printed off the internet earlier that night at a print shop on Carondelet that stayed open until 2. The map showed Bourbon Street between Iberville and St. Louis. There were small notes in pencil along the margins. One of the notes was at the corner of Bourbon and Bienville. The note said, "Pedicab stand, 3 to 4. They had been planning to use a pedicab. They had been planning to use my pedicab. They had walked their map for 2 nights to figure out who was at that stand at that hour. They had walked past me 3 times in the previous week. I do not remember seeing them. They had been in different clothes each time. The detective said the map had photographs paper-clipped to it of 3 of the pedicab drivers in the rotation. I was one. Finn was one. The third was a girl named Vesper who only worked the daytime hours and probably would not have been there at 3. They had picked me because I was usually alone at that hour and because I had a reputation for taking long fares without asking too many questions. The thing I did not know until later was that they had been planning to use me twice. The map had a second note at the corner of Decatur and St. Philip, near the French Market loading bay. The second note said, "Pedicab return, second loop." I did not know what that meant for a long time. The detective explained it to me eventually. She said the plan had been to take the woman to a holding house on Esplanade Ridge using the pedicab, then send the pedicab back, and the brothers would walk back to Bourbon and pick a second woman before sunrise. The pedicab driver, who in their plan would be me, would be left with the first woman for 30 minutes while the brothers handled the second pickup. I would be the driver. I would not be the abductor. They would have made me look like the abductor on the cameras. That is what the second man meant when he said get off the bike. He was not just stealing the cab. He was clearing me out so they could pick a different driver, or do it themselves, or leave the cab somewhere I could not deny later. I did not realize it that night. I figured it out about a month after, in the shower, and stood there with the water going for 20 minutes. Lacey and I broke up the next year, for reasons that were nothing to do with any of this. Pin moved back to Pittsburgh and works for the post office now. The jogger, the off-duty officer, came to my band's show at Bacchanal 2 months later with her wife and bought us a round and did not bring up that night until the very end of the set when she came up and squeezed my arm and said, "You doing okay?" And I said, "Mostly." The mule carriage driver retired the next year. The produce guy still works at that restaurant. I saw him at the back loading bay last summer, and he gave me a green pepper as a joke, and I ate it on the ride home. I quit pedicab driving 4 months after that night. Not because of the night, because my knees had finally gone. I work days now at a hardware store on St. Claude. I still play bass. The band changed names twice and is called Burnt Coffee now. Lacey is married to a guy who teaches at Tulane. We are friendly when we run into each other. Carl the dog died of old age in the second winter after. What I think about when I think about it, which is less than it was but more than 0, is the corner. Bourbon and Bienville. 3:10 in the morning. The wadded napkin on the woman's heel where her other shoe should have been. The string of saliva on the second man's coat. The way the first man paused for half a second on a name. I think about the map the second man had in his pocket. I think about the marks at the corner of Bourbon and Bienville. The note, pedicab stand, 3 to 4. The hour they had picked. The hour I had been at that stand for 3 years. I think about the cap I never noticed them in. The clothes they had walked past me in 3 times that week that I cannot picture, no matter how hard I try. I think about the second note on the map. Pedicab return, second loop. The second woman they were planning to take after Sarah, she was not Sarah. She was a woman. She was a Friday night Bourbon Street tourist with one shoe gone. She is somewhere I do not know now, sleeping in a normal bed, in a normal house, and she never saw the second note. She does not know it was about her. I have never told her. I have never told anyone other than Detective Holcomb. Detective Holcomb said it was not mine to tell. She is right. The cab is in storage in a yard off Chupatula's behind a fence with razor wire. The company sold it to me for $1 when I quit. I do not know why I bought it. I have not ridden it since. Sometimes I drive past that yard and look through the fence. I can see the seat back through the chain link. The seat back is empty. It has been empty for 3 years. But there are nights I drive past and I have to look twice. Room 211. Room 211 came up short on the folio for the 3rd time that month, and the night audit kicked back the variance at 3:14 in the morning. I ran the report a second time. The variance was still there. The lobby was quiet in the way it gets between 3 and 4, when even the late drunks have gone to bed and the bread trucks have not yet come down Royal. I had been the night auditor at the Magnolia House Hotel for 3 months. Before that I had been 21 years in the Army, the last 6 of those teaching crew-served weapons at Fort Polk to soldiers who were younger every year. I had retired at 41 and moved with my wife to New Orleans because she had taken an ICU nurse job at Tulane. The hotel job was supposed to be a soft landing. The pay was $13 an hour. The shift was 11 at night to 7 in the morning, 5 nights a week, with my Saturdays and Sundays off. The work was easy. Run the audit, check guests in if they came in late, hand out a key if someone locked themselves out, brew the coffee at 6, hand the desk off to the morning clerk at 7. I had taken the job because my wife worked overnights 3 days a week and because I did not sleep well at night anyway. I had not taken it because I needed the money. My name is Roy. I was 43 then. My wife is Sarah. We had been married 18 years. We had no kids. We had a small house in the Bywater with a yard for our dog Bucky, who was a brindle pit mix with a torn ear and the disposition of a Sunday morning. We were doing all right. I was the kind of all right where I had a job I did not hate, and a wife I loved, and a dog who loved me back, and I had not figured out yet what was wrong with me that I still could not sleep. The audit, in its way, was helping with that. The audit is a slow, methodical process. It runs the day's transactions through a check, balances the cash drawer against the credit card receipts, posts charges to folios, runs the no-shows, generates the morning reports, and closes the business day. The system does most of it. The auditor checks the work and signs off. A clean audit takes me about 40 minutes. A messy audit can take 2 hours. Room 211 had been a messy audit for 3 months running. The folio kept getting small charges that I could not match to anything. A minibar charge on a Tuesday for a guest who had checked out on Monday. A movie rental on a Wednesday for a room that had not been occupied since Saturday. A water bottle from the hospitality station charged at 15-minute intervals across an empty Thursday night. The charges were always small. They were the kind of charges nobody catches because they are too small to matter. A $12 minibar charge does not blow up an audit. A $12 minibar charge gets queried, gets resolved with a void, gets forgotten about by morning. I started keeping a list. The list was on a yellow legal pad I kept in the bottom drawer of the audit desk. By the 3rd month of writing on the pad, I had 37 entries on it for room 211 and somewhere between 2 and 7 entries on it for every other room. Room 211 is a corner room on the 2nd floor of the front building of the Magnolia House. The front building has 9 rooms on the 2nd floor arranged around the L-shaped hallway. Room 211, sits at the elbow of the L, where the long hallway meets the short one. It has 2 windows. One faces Royal Street. One faces the small slate roof of the breakfast room downstairs. The room is small for the hotel. It has a king bed, a small desk, an armchair, a flat screen on a brass swivel, and a bathroom with a clawfoot tub and a brass shower head that drips constantly because the seal in the mixer is shot. The Magnolia House has 24 rooms. The front building has 15 of them on 3 floors. The back building, across a courtyard with a fountain that runs day and night, has 9 on 2 floors. There is a small pool in the courtyard that nobody swims in because it is always cold. The hotel was a private home built in the 1870s. It has been a hotel since 1986. It is owned by a holding company in Florida. The general manager is a woman named Linda who has worked there for 14 years. The day desk clerk is a kid named Jamal who is studying nursing at Delgado. The housekeeping manager is a woman everybody calls Miss Rosalie who has worked there longer than Linda. The maintenance man is Cy, who is 66 and grumpy and good at his job. I am the night audit. There are 2 ways to get into a guest room at the Magnolia House. The first is a key card, which is what the guests get. The card encodes to the door lock on check-in. The second is a brass master key, of which there are 3. Linda has one, Cy has one. The third lives in a lockbox behind the front desk and is for the night audit, which is me. I have used it twice in 3 months, both times to let in a guest who had lost their card after the bar. The third master, the one in the lockbox, is the master that I used in my 3rd month to go into room 211. I will say what I noticed before I went in, because the order matters. The folio variances had been accumulating for months before I started, going back, when I pulled the report later, almost 3 years. There had been other small things too. There had been a complaint logged in the property management system from a guest in March of the previous year about a feeling of being watched in the room. There had been a complaint in June about a missing piece of jewelry, a small silver ring the guest had left on the bedside table. There had been a complaint in November about an open drawer the guest was sure she had closed. There had been a complaint in February of that year about the closet door being open in the morning when the guest was sure she had closed it the night before. There had been a complaint in April about a missing pair of underwear from a suitcase, which the guest had reported to the front desk with a face like she was about to apologize, and which Linda had logged and refunded $100 on the rate. I had read every complaint in the system over my first 3 months. I read them when I had no audit to run, which was most of every night. I read them because I had been bored. I read them because I had been an instructor for 6 years and had a habit of looking for patterns in incident reports. I noticed 2 things about the complaints. The first was that they were all from female guests. There had been 31 guest complaints filed against room 211 over 5 years. All 31 had been filed by women. I checked this against the room's overall occupancy. Female-only guests booked room 211 about 1/3 of the time. The complaints came from 100% of them. The second was that the complaints had a quiet pattern. They were not the loud complaints about a hair in the tub or a leaking shower. They were the small complaints about a thing being moved a little, or a thing being missing, or a feeling of being watched. They were the kind of complaints a guest files because she has to convince herself she is not being paranoid and writes it down so she is not the only person who knows it happened. I did not say anything to Linda about it for 2 weeks. I told myself I was probably reading too much into it. I told myself old hotels have weird rooms. I told myself the room had a window onto Royal, and Royal had bars on it, and bars meant noise, and noise meant guests reported strange things. None of those things were untrue. None of them explained the variance on the folio either. I told Sarah about it in the kitchen one Sunday morning over coffee. Sarah is the smartest person I know. She is also the most patient. She listened to me. She asked me questions. She did the thing she does when she is thinking, which is she runs her thumbnail along the edge of her bottom lip. She said, "Roy, you should put a camera in the hallway." I said, "I cannot just put a camera in the hallway." She said, "Why?" I said, Because the hallway is not mine to put a camera in. She said, "Tell Linda." I said, "And tell her what?" She said, "Tell her you have a pattern." She was right. I told Linda that Monday. I sat down with her in her office, and I laid the yellow pad on her desk, and I walked her through the variances and the complaints. Linda listened. She did not say much. She is not a talker. She is a 58-year-old woman who runs a 24-room hotel by herself, with the help of a kid and a grumpy man, and a housekeeper who is twice her age, and she does not have time for nonsense. She read the pad, she pulled up the property management system on her computer, she ran reports of her own. She was quiet for almost 10 minutes. She said, "Roy, this is not nothing." I said, "I know." And she said, "I should have caught this 2 years ago." I said, "It was small. They were all small. It is the kind of thing you only see if you put them all together." She said, "Yeah." We put the camera in the hallway that night. It was a small wireless camera Linda bought at a hardware store on Esplanade for $68. It was the size of a deck of cards. We hid it inside a dry floral arrangement on the small pier table in the hallway between rooms 210 and 212. The lens looked out at the door of room 211 through a gap between the eucalyptus stems. The camera had a battery and a memory card. It would record on motion. Nobody would know it was there unless they were looking for it. We left it for 4 nights. On the 4th night, at 2:41 in the morning, the camera recorded a man walking up the second-floor hallway from the rear stairs. He was wearing a black jacket and a black ball cap. He was carrying a small canvas backpack. He stopped at the door of room 211. He took a brass key out of his coat pocket and unlocked the door. He let himself in. He closed the door behind him. He stayed in the room until 5:17 in the morning. He came back out. He locked the door behind him. He walked back down the second-floor hallway to the rear stairs and out of frame. Linda called me at home at 8:20 in the morning, 20 minutes after she had reviewed the card on her computer in her office. I had been asleep for 90 minutes. She said, "Roy, you need to come in." I drove to the hotel. We watched the footage 3 times. The 3rd time, Linda paused the video on the man's face. He was looking up at the room number as he keyed in. His face was visible for about 2 seconds. It was a man I had not seen before, but Linda had. Linda said, "That is Devin." I said, "Who?" She said, "Devin worked the front desk for 6 years. I fired him in May." I said, "What for?" She said, "He came to a shift drunk. Twice. The 2nd time, he said something to a guest he should not have said. I had to let him go. He took it bad. He said some things to me in this office that I have not repeated. I have been telling myself for a year that I should have changed the locks on the front and the back when he left, but the key system in this building is the original brass, and you cannot just change the locks without rekeying every door. And Linda, the general manager, and the holding company in Florida do not always see eye to eye on capital improvements." She said the last part with the tone of a woman who knows what a mistake looks like in retrospect. I said, "He still has a key." She said, "He still has a key." We called the 8th District. The desk sergeant said, "Send him the footage." We sent it. He called back in an hour. He said they were aware of Devin. Devin had a record for a minor stalking complaint from a former girlfriend in 2023. He had not been arrested for it because the woman had dropped the complaint. He was currently working as a server at a restaurant in the Marigny. The sergeant said, "The question is whether to wait for him to come back and catch him in the act or pick him up at his apartment now." Linda said, "I want him caught in the act." I said, "I want him caught in the act." The sergeant said, "All right then." We left the camera in the hallway. The 8th District put 2 plainclothes officers on the property that night. They sat in a vacant room at the end of the hallway with the door open a crack. Linda and I sat in the back office on the 1st floor with the security monitor and a thermos of coffee. The hotel was sold out that weekend except for room 211, which had been blocked off for maintenance. Devin did not come the 1st night. He did not come the 2nd. On the 3rd night, at 1:58 in the morning, the camera in the hallway caught him coming up the rear stairs again. He was in the same black jacket and the same black ball cap. He had the same canvas backpack, The wait those 3 nights was the worst part of the job I had ever done. The 2 plainclothes officers stayed in the vacant room at the end of the hallway and read paperback books on rotation and ate sandwiches Linda brought up from the breakfast room. Linda and I sat in the back office with the security monitor between us and a thermos of coffee on the file cabinet. The monitor showed a black and white view of the second-floor hallway. Nothing moved on the monitor for hours at a time. A guest would come up the front stairs around 2 in the morning and walk to a room, and the camera would clock the motion, and the file would save, and the guest would close the door behind them, and the hallway would be still again. Linda did not talk much on those nights. She had been the GM for 14 years. She had hired Devin. She had walked him out of the building on the day she had fired him. She was carrying something for those 3 nights that I did not have the language to ask about, and that she did not have the language to put down. And we sat in the office and drank the coffee and watched the monitor and did not talk about it. On the second night, around 4 in the morning, she said, "He was a good front desk for a long time, Roy." I said, "I believe it." She said, "He was the kind of front desk who would remember a guest's name from a year ago. He could greet a return guest by their first name without looking at the screen. The guests loved him." And I said, "Yeah." She said, "I have been turning over my whole memory of him for 2 weeks. Every shift handover, every conversation in this office. I am trying to find the place where I should have seen it." I said, "It would not have been visible." She said, "Roy, you are kind, but it had to have been visible somewhere. I just was not looking." I did not have an answer to that. I am not a man who knows how to tell another person they were not at fault for a thing that happened on their watch, because I do not believe it most of the time. I believe most of the time that watch is exactly the right word, and the watch is the responsibility, and you do not get out of it by pleading ignorance. I sat with her in the office, and we watched the monitor. On the 3rd night, the motion alert chimed at 1:58. We both looked up. Devin was on the screen. I will say this clean. The arrest was not loud. The 2 plainclothes officers stepped out into the hallway as Devin was unlocking the door. They identified themselves. They told him to put his hands on the wall. He did not run. He looked at them. He looked at the camera in the eucalyptus, which one of the officers had pointed at on the way in to make sure he could see it. He looked at the floor. He put his hands on the wall. In his backpack was a brass key to the hotel, 2 prepaid phones, a roll of black electrical tape, a set of small screwdrivers, a small powered drill with a 1/4-inch bit, a small black box about the size of a deck of cards with a USB cable, a notebook, and a small bag with 2 pairs of women's underwear in it. I did not learn what was in the backpack until 2 days later. The detective told me. He told me because I had been the one who put it together. He said the worst part was not in the backpack. The worst part was in the ceiling of room 211. The plainclothes officers had cleared the room after the arrest. They had not searched it carefully. The next day, the 8th District sent a detective and a tech and a crime scene unit. They took the ceiling apart. There was a small ventilation grill on the ceiling above the bed. The grill was original to the building. It was the kind of decorative iron grill you see in old houses where there used to be gas lighting. The grill had been removed and replaced with a screw that did not match. Behind the grill, on the inside of the ceiling, was a small camera the size of a deck of cards. It was not Devin's camera. It was a different camera. The detective said the camera in the backpack had been a replacement. The camera in the ceiling had been there longer. The detective said the camera was wired to a tiny battery and a tiny transmitter, and the transmitter sent footage to a receiver that lived somewhere within a 100-foot radius. He said the receiver had been in the back attic of the hotel, accessible through a hatch in the linen closet on the 3rd floor that nobody used because the hatch had been painted shut. The hatch had not been painted shut. The hatch had been painted to look painted shut. Devin had cut around the paint with a utility knife. The paint had been resealed with a thin bead of caulk that was the same color as the trim. The detective showed me the bead later. He said he would not have noticed it if he had not been looking. The attic above the third floor of the front building had a folding chair set up in front of the hatch. The chair had a worn spot on the seat. Next to the chair was a milk crate with a small monitor, a battery pack, and an external hard drive. The hard drive was full. The detective took it as evidence. He said it would take the lab weeks to process. He said something I will say here cleanly, because it is what he said. He said, "There are cameras in 3 other rooms." He said the techs had found them that day. He said 2 of them were active. He said 1 had been removed at some point. He said the rooms with active cameras were rooms 207, 304, and 311. He said the room with the removed camera was room 112. Sarah and I had stayed at the Magnolia House for a weekend in October of the year before I started working there. The hotel had had a soft opening special after a renovation. Sarah and I had been new to the city. We had wanted to stay somewhere in the quarter for our anniversary. We had had a Saturday night dinner at a place on Royal, and walked back to the hotel and watched a movie in bed and slept late on Sunday. We had stayed in room 211. The detective did not know this when he told me about the cameras. I did not say it to him in his office that day. I waited until I got home. I sat down at the kitchen table with Sarah, and I told her. We had been married 18 years, and I have never seen her face do what it did in that minute. It was not panic, it was not anger, it was a stillness I did not know she had. She held the coffee mug in her hand without moving it for what felt like a minute, and then she put it down on the table without making a sound, and she said, "Roy." I said, "I know." She said, "Roy." I said, "I know." The hard drive took the lab 11 weeks to process. The detective called me the day they finished. I drove to his office. He sat me down. He said, "I have to be straight with you. The drive has footage from room 211 going back almost 4 years. There is a file that is dated October, your anniversary weekend. I have not watched it. I do not have to. You and your wife are not the subject of an investigation. The file will be destroyed when the case is closed." I said, "Thank you." He said, "I am sorry, Roy." I said, "It is not your fault." He said, "Yeah." I went home. I told Sarah. She was sitting in the kitchen. The dog was on her feet. She listened. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, "Did it happen?" I said, "Yes." She said, okay." She got up from the table. She went out into the yard and stood at the back fence in the rain for 10 minutes. The dog stood with her. I watched her from the kitchen window. I did not go out to her. I knew her well enough to know she did not want me out there yet. When she came in, she took my hand at the back door and she said, "I am going to be all right. We are going to be all right. We are going to make a decision about this together." We made a decision about it together. We did not talk to a lawyer. We did not press a separate civil case. We let the detective tell us when to come for the destruction of the drive. We did go for that. The lab destroyed the drive in our presence. They cut it in half with a bandsaw. They handed us the 2 halves of the platter. We took them home in a Ziploc bag and put them in a drawer in the kitchen, and we have not opened that drawer since for that purpose, though we used the drawer for other things, because the drawer is the drawer where the tape and the batteries and the loose screws live. In the weeks between the detective's call and the destruction, Sarah did not sleep much. She did not talk to me about it more than once or twice. She talked to her sister in Denver on the phone for hours at a stretch with the bedroom door closed. She started running again in the mornings before her shift 3 miles along the river levee, which she had not done since we had moved to the city. She lost weight. She came home from her shifts and ate dinner at the table with me, and we watched a show about a baking competition, and she would laugh at the right places, and I would watch her laugh, and I would think about how a person carries a thing without giving the thing away, and how a person who has carried things for other people for a living has more practice at that than the rest of us. One night, she said, in the dark, after the lights were out, "Roy." I said, "Yeah." She said, "I am not angry at you." I said, "Okay." And she said, "I want to make sure you know that, because you have not asked." I said, "I have not asked because I was afraid of the answer." She said, "It is not your fault." I said, I know. She said, do you know? I said, most of the time. She said, okay. She turned over and put her hand on my chest. We did not talk any more that night. The dog snored from the foot of the bed. Devin was charged with 23 counts of unlawful surveillance, multiple counts of burglary, multiple counts of theft, multiple counts of stalking, and 4 counts of producing recordings of nudity without consent. He took a plea. He is serving 22 years in Angola. He will be 64 when he gets out. I will be 65. Linda left the hotel 6 months after the arrest. The holding company in Florida had asked her to handle a press response that she would not handle the way they wanted her to. She quit. She runs a bed and breakfast in Covington now with her sister. She sends me a Christmas card every year. The card has a picture of a wreath on the door. Cy retired the next spring. Miss Rosalie retired 6 months after Cy. The holding company sold the hotel to another holding company. The new holding company rebranded the property. The new property name is something with the word luxury in it that I will not say. The new property had to rekey the entire building, which had needed to be done since the day Devin was let go, and which the old holding company had refused to fund for $12,000. I worked at the Magnolia House for another 5 months after Linda left. I quit when the new owners brought in a manager who wanted to renegotiate the night audit rate. I work days now at a Veterans Affairs office on Poydras doing intake. The work is paperwork. The pay is better. I sleep better some nights now, not every night. Sarah is at Tulane still. She is up for a charge nurse role this year. Bucky the dog is 11 years old and has cataracts and the disposition of a Sunday morning. When I think about it, which is more than I used to but less than I did the first year, is the eucalyptus arrangement on the pier table in the second floor hallway. The way the dried stalks made a gap just wide enough to see a door. The way Linda put the camera in herself with steady hands at 6 o'clock in the evening while a guest came down the hall and asked her where the ice machine was. I think about the bead of caulk on the hatch in the linen closet, the color of the trim, the line of it so clean I would have walked past it for the rest of my life. I think about the worn spot on the seat of the folding chair. I think about my wife in the rain at the back fence with the dog at her feet, and the way she said, "We are going to be all right," and then she came in and took my hand at the back door. I think about the 2 halves of the platter in the drawer in the kitchen with the loose screws and the batteries and the tape, where the drawer sticks a little when you pull it because the cabinet has settled in this old house. The cottage door behind us closing slow. The bell on the front desk of the Magnolia House ringing for the morning clerk. The first bread truck on Royal at 6:04, the way the brakes always squealed at the corner of St. Philip. The brass key in Devin's hand the night of the arrest, catching the light of the hallway sconce before he put it down on the floor. The brass key, the same brass. The drawer, the hatch, the line of caulk, Sarah in the yard, the rain, the quiet one at the end of the bar. The cooler door at Maggie's never sealed right, and on a slow night you could hear it click through the back wall like a tongue clucking. That was how I knew the man at the end of the bar had been sitting there for almost 3 hours. The cooler had opened and shut 14 times that I counted, and his Abita amber had not moved. I was the only bartender on. Tuesdays in November are dead in the quarter unless something big is happening at the Superdome, and nothing was. The bar held maybe 8 people total. 2 construction guys eating po' boys at the high top by the door. A woman on a Tinder date working through her phone. An old regular named Dale who came in for the cheap pour and the air conditioning. A bachelorette stragglers party of 3 who had wandered off bourbon by mistake and were halfway through a round of bad decisions. And the man at the end of the bar is the L-bend, the corner where the wood meets the wall and the pour spouts hang above the speed rail. That seat gets picked by 2 types. People who want to talk to the bartender. People who want to watch the door. He was watching the door. I told myself it was the door he was watching and not me, because if I told myself he was watching me, I would have had to do something about it, and I was not going to do anything about it that Tuesday. My name is Tucker. I was 31 then. I had been at Maggie's for almost 5 years. I had moved to New Orleans from Mobile when my engagement fell apart, and the only person I knew here was an old high school friend named Wade who tended at a place on Decatur and owed me a couch for a month. The couch turned into a sublet. The sublet turned into a slip job under the table at Maggie's. The slip job turned into a regular Wednesday through Sunday graveyard shift behind the stick. That was that. I never went back to Mobile. My apartment was 2 blocks off Esplanade in a stucco fourplex that had a crack running down the back wall like a river on a map. My rent was $800 a month because the landlord was a retired nurse who liked me. I had a cat named Ginsberg. I had a girlfriend named Annie who tended at a place on Dauphine and was almost certainly cheating on me with a touring drummer from Atlanta. I did not yet care about the drummer. I would care later. That night, I was tired and the cooler door kept clicking and the man at the end of the bar had not moved. He looked maybe 45, thinning brown hair under a faded blue Saints cap, leather jacket, too warm for the bar, jeans, work boots that had no mud on them, a wedding ring, plain gold, on the right hand instead of the left. I did not know what to make of the ring. People put me wrong all the time, too. He had ordered an Abita Amber when he came in at 11. I had set it down. He had said thanks. He had laid a 10 on the bar. I had given him change. He had pushed $2 back at me as a tip. Standard. The kind of polite that does not stand out. The beer had gone untouched. Around midnight I asked him if he wanted another. He smiled and said no, he was good, and pulled the beer closer like a kid protecting a pile of crackers. I noticed his fingernails were clean. Short, clean, square, not a working hands kind of man. Office hands, maybe. I noticed, too, that he did not have a phone out. Everyone in a bar has a phone out. He had no phone, no book, no friend, no laptop, nothing. He was looking at the door, then at the back hallway where the bathrooms were, then at me, then at the door again, in a pattern that took about 30 seconds to repeat. The first time I clocked the pattern, I told myself I was reading too much into a man minding his own business. That happens when you bartend in the Quarter. You get suspicious of everyone, and then you have to remind yourself most people are just people. A man can nurse a beer and look at things without being a problem. I had done that myself in other bars, when something at home was rough and I needed to be somewhere that was not home. Maybe he had a wife who was angry. Maybe he had a sick parent at Toro. Maybe he was waiting for a delivery he was too embarrassed to admit was a delivery. But the cooler kept clicking and his beer kept not moving and his eyes kept doing the pattern, and at 1:20 in the morning I noticed something that got under my skin. A young woman came out of the bathroom hallway and walked back to her table at the front. She was with the bachelorette stragglers. She was the tallest one of them, in a denim jacket and a white t-shirt that had been written on by her friends in Sharpie. When she walked past the end of the bar, the man's eyes did not move with her. He stared at the door. He held perfectly still until she was past him, and then his head turned slowly and watched her walk back to her seat. Then he turned back to the door. I poured a Hennessy for one of the construction guys. He said something to me about the Saints game. I nodded and said the right thing. I have done 100,000 Hennessy pours in my life. I can do them while my brain is somewhere else, and my brain was at the end of the bar. At 1:40, the bachelorette stragglers settled up and left. They were laughing too loud, and their go-cups were too full, and they were going to be on bourbon in 3 minutes. The man at the end of the bar got up. He did not walk fast. He left his beer there full. He put a 10 on the bar, even though I had not charged him for a second drink. He nodded at me and walked out. I went around the bar and looked through the front window. He was walking up Conti toward Bourbon, about 30 feet behind the 3 girls. He was not closing on them. He was not trying to catch them. He was matching their pace. The construction guys were arguing about a play. Dale was asleep on his folded arm. The Tinder woman was now crying into her phone, and the man on the screen looked confused and a little drunk himself. I stood there for maybe 20 seconds. Then I went back behind the bar and called Wade. Wade picked up on the second ring. He was off that night, but he was awake, 'cause he always was. I said, I think a creep just left here following 3 drunk girls toward Bourbon. Wade said, "Did you say anything?" I said, "No." Wade said, "Then go say something." I left my barback D watching the floor and walked up Conti. I caught up to them at the corner of Bourbon and Conti, where the Lucky Dog cart sits. The girls had stopped to argue about which bar to hit next. The man was standing maybe 10 feet behind them, looking into the front window of a daiquiri place like he was reading the prices. I walked up to him and said, "Hey, man." He turned, calm. He smiled the kind of smile that gets practiced in front of a mirror. He said, "Help you?" I said, "You forgot your beer." He said, "I wasn't thirsty." I said, "You sat for 3 hours." He said, "Long day." We stood there a second. The girls had not noticed us. One of them was on her phone. One of them was leaning on a friend. A mounted cop walked his horse past us, and the smell of horse hit hard and then was gone. The man's smile did not move. I said, "Where are you parked?" He said, "Around." I said, "Take care then." He nodded. He turned and walked the other way, up Bourbon, away from the girls. He did not look back. I watched him until he turned at Bienville. The girls walked into a bar with a hand-painted sign that said "No cover before 2." I went back to Maggie's and finished my shift. Around 4, when the kitchen had closed and the last drunk had paid out, Dee said, "What was that earlier?" Dee was 19. She was a Loyola student paying her way through with the bar job and a side hustle, doing some kind of pen and ink on Royal during the day. She had 2 long braids and a nose ring and a face that was hard to read on purpose. I said, "Guy at the end of the bar was watching the door." She said, "The Saint's cap." I looked at her. I said, "You saw him?" She said, "He's been in before." I said, "When?" She said, 3 times this week, maybe 4. He sits at the end. He never finishes a beer. He watches the bathroom hallway. I thought he was waiting for a hookup or something. I figured one of the other girls knew him. I had not seen him before that Tuesday, but Dee worked Mondays and Tuesdays, and some Fridays I worked Wednesday through Sunday. We barely overlapped except for shift change. He had been coming in on her shifts and on mine, and neither of us had clocked it as a pattern because we did not talk about every weirdo who passed through. There were too many. I said, "Did he ever do anything?" She said, "He asked me what time I got off once." She said it the way you say something embarrassing in the dark when you do not want it to land too hard. She said it the way you might say, "I think I left the stove on." She did not look at me. She was wiping the speed rail. I said, "When?" She said, 2 weeks ago. I told him 5. He said he liked the bar. He said he liked the way I worked. I told him thanks. He paid and left. I said, "Did he wait for you outside?" She said, "I don't know. I left the back way." We did not say anything for a minute. Dee finished the speed rail. I started flipping chairs. The cooler clicked, and we both looked at the back wall. I called Wade the next day at noon. I told him the whole thing. He said the back way out of his bar had a door that opened onto a courtyard with a service gate to Royal, and he said most bars in the quarter had something like that. He said I should tell Dee to use the back way always, and tell her to text me when she got to her car. He said I should call the 8th District non-emergency line and ask if they had any reports of someone matching the description loitering near bars in the quarter. He said I should not be a hero. I called the 8th District. The desk sergeant was patient with me. He took the description. He asked if there had been any contact. I said no. He said he would put a note in the system. He said if I saw the man again, I should call them and they would send a cruiser to do a stop. He said this kind of thing happens all the time in the quarter, and most of the time it turns out to be nothing. I said, "And the other time?" He said, "Other times we are real glad somebody called." I worked the next 4 nights. The man did not come in. I walked Dee to her car after every shift that week and the week after. Her car was a tan Corolla with a dented quarter panel parked in a pay lot off Iberville that she paid $40 a month for because it was cheaper than the metered spots. The walk was 3 blocks. We did not talk about him on the walk. We talked about her ceramics class and a movie she had seen and a guy named Tommy who she was not sure about. I kept my hand near my phone in my jacket pocket the whole way. The lot had one light at the far corner, and it was always either on or out, and it was out 3 of the 7 nights I walked her. I told her I was going to write the lot owner. I never did. Annie did not come home Saturday and texted me Sunday morning that the drummer was a friend and she had crashed at his hotel. I told her I knew it was not the truth, and we ended things on the phone in the parking lot of the Walgreens on Esplanade where I had pulled over because my hands were shaking too hard to drive. I sat in my car and watched a man across the street try to sell a busted air mattress to 2 college kids. The kids laughed and walked off. The man folded up the air mattress and walked toward Rampart with it under his arm. I went home and slept until 5. I ate cereal for dinner. I went to work. The man came back on Wednesday. He sat in the same seat. Saints cap, leather jacket, work boots. He ordered an Abita Amber. I poured it slow, on purpose. I made eye contact when I set it down. He smiled, the practice smile. He said, "How's your night?" I said, "Long." He said, "Slow." He paid with a 10. He pushed $2 back at me. The bar was busier than the Tuesday before because it was a long weekend coming up and the quarter was filling. I had to work the bar all night. I did not have time to track his pattern for 2 hours. But I noticed 3 things, and I will lay them out in the order I noticed them. He had a backpack now, set on the floor between his feet. He had not had a backpack the week before. It was a small black canvas backpack with a clip on the side and a water bottle in the netting. It looked like nothing. That was the point. The second thing was that he was sitting 1 stool closer to the back hallway than the week before. The end seat had been taken by a guy in a Tulane sweatshirt who was working through a draft citer and reading a book. The man had taken the next one down, which put him 5 feet closer to the bathroom door. From his new seat, he could see down the hallway to the back exit if the bathroom door was open. The bathroom door was usually open because the latch was bent. Maintenance had been on the list for 6 weeks. The third thing was that he had a new watch. Or maybe the watch was not new, and I had just not seen it before, but I noticed it that night because the band was bright red, and it did not match the rest of him. It was an outdoor sport watch with a screen and a fabric strap. It looked like a runner's watch. The screen was dimmed. He glanced at it twice in the half hour I was paying attention. The second time he glanced, he turned to the back hallway, and a woman came out of the bathroom and walked toward the door. He was timing things. I did not have a way to prove that. I am not going to pretend I did. But sometime around midnight, I went into the office in the back and called the 8th District again from the landline because my cell was dying. The desk sergeant from before was off. The woman I got was polite but not interested. She said the same things. She said call again if anything happened. She said they could not park a cruiser outside my bar on a hunch. I went back to the bar. The man was gone. His beer was on the bar, 3/4 full. The backpack was gone with him. That was the night he did not come back. I do not know where he went. He did not follow anyone out that I saw. He just left. I did not see him for 9 days. By the time he came back the 3rd time, I had stopped looking. Not stopped exactly. I had moved him to a back drawer in my head. You cannot run a bar in the French Quarter and stay alert to every weird guy who shows up twice. You will burn out in 3 months. You learn to clock and forget. The man at the end had been clocked and was on the back drawer. He came in on a Saturday around 11. The bar was packed. There was a brass band somewhere off Royal that you could hear when the front door opened. D was off. I had a second bartender on, a guy named Hollis, who had been bumped over from a sister bar for the night because the owner was trying to test his fit. Hollis was fine. He was slow, but he was fine. The night was running smooth in the way that means you have to watch hard because anything could break it. I clocked the man when he came in. He sat at the end. He ordered an Abita. He paid with a 10. He left 2 for me. He did not look at me long. I did not call the police. I will say why I did not call. I have thought about it 1,000 times since, and I cannot come up with a better answer. I did not call because nothing had happened. He had come in, he had ordered a beer, he had sat, that was it. I knew what the dispatcher would say. I had heard her say it. He had not committed a crime. He was a customer. I did not call. The woman he picked up was named Hannah. I learned her name later. She was in town from Houston with 2 friends and a sister for her sister's bachelorette weekend. They were not drunk yet when they came in. They had a round of frozen margaritas and ordered a second. They sat at a 4-top at the front for maybe 40 minutes. They were laughing. The sister, who was the bachelorette, was wearing a sash and a little plastic crown. Hannah was the maid of honor, I think. She had a bigger laugh than the rest. She kept the others moving. Around 1 a.m, 2 of the friends went to the bathroom, and Hannah went to the bar to settle up. She came up to my side. Hollis was working the other side. I wrung her out. $62. She put on a black card and tipped 25%. I said, "Y'all have a good night." She said, "Where should we go next?" I said, "Depends. You want loud or quiet?" She said, "Loud." I said, "Then go 2 blocks that way and you'll find it." She laughed. She said, "Thanks, baby." She walked back to the table. The other 2 came out of the bathroom. The 4 of them gathered their things. The bachelorette had to take a selfie at the door. They left. 2 minutes later, the man at the end of the bar got up and walked out. That was when I moved. I told Hollis to watch the bar. I did not say why. I have a regular named Bobby Lee who was in that night sitting at the bar near the back, a 60-year-old retired NOPD detective who came in for 1 maker's mark on the rocks every Saturday and tipped huge. I caught his eye on the way out and said, "Bobby Lee, I need help. Now." Bobby Lee did not ask anything. He stood up. He paid his tab in cash on the way to the door because that was the kind of man he was. We came out on Decatur Street. The brass band was still going somewhere south. The air was cool and wet. I saw the 4 women turning right onto Bourbon, and I saw the man maybe 20 feet behind them, walking the way he had walked the first night. Pace matched. Posture relaxed. Eyes on the back of Hannah's head. I said to Bobby Lee, "Saint's cap, leather jacket. He's been coming in for a month. He follows them out." Bobby Lee said, "What's the play?" I said, "I don't know." Bobby Lee said, "Then we just walk." We walked. We stayed 20 feet behind the man. He did not turn around once. The women went into a daiquiri place on Bourbon. The man slowed and stood across the street, leaning against a parked car. He pulled out a phone. He scrolled. He looked over the phone at the door of the daiquiri place every 20 seconds. Bobby Lee said, "He's working a pattern." I said, "Yeah." Bobby Lee said, "You called the 8th. I said, "Twice." Nothing. Bobby Lee said, "Call them now. Tell them I'm on scene. Use my name." I called the non-emergency line. I gave them Bobby Lee's name. The dispatcher's voice changed. She said a unit would come. She said, "Keep eyes on." She said, "Do not engage." We did not engage. We stood across Bourbon eating fried chicken from a place that had been open for 30 years and watching the man watch the door. The women came out of the daiquiri place after maybe 20 minutes. The bachelorette had a new daiquiri in a tall plastic souvenir cup. They walked north on Bourbon toward Toulouse. The man followed. We followed the man. The cruiser showed up at Toulouse. 2 NOPD officers, one I knew by sight from the 8th District beat. Bobby Lee waved them down. They stopped. He talked to them for maybe 30 seconds. They pulled the cruiser up to the curb and got out. The man saw them. He turned and started walking the other way, fast, not running, walking with intention. He turned at St. Louis and headed toward Royal. One of the officers went after him on foot. The other got back in the cruiser and went around. Bobby Lee said to me, "Go to the girls." I crossed Bourbon. The women had not noticed any of it. They were laughing and trying to get into another bar that had a line at the door. I walked up to Hannah. I said, "Hannah," from Maggie's. She looked confused, but she recognized me. I said, "There was a man following y'all out of my bar. We called police. He just bolted. I just wanted you to know." She said, "What?" I said, "I wanted you to know y'all should stay together, use a rideshare when you go back." She said, "Are you serious?" I said, "I'm serious." The bachelorette was already in the doorway of the next bar, but the sister, Hannah's sister, was right next to her, and she heard me. Her face went still. She said, "Okay, thank you, thank you." I said, "Stay together." I walked back to where Bobby Lee was waiting. The officer who had gone on foot came back about 10 minutes later with the man in cuffs. He had run 2 blocks and tried to cut through Pirates Alley, and an off-duty cab driver had clipped him with the side mirror of an idling car. He was scraped up. The backpack was still on his back. I will say what was in the backpack because the detective who interviewed me later told me. He told me because he said he wanted me to understand that I had not been crazy. He told me because he said sometimes the bartender is the only person in the chain who is paying attention. In the backpack were 3 rolls of duct tape, a coil of paracord, a pair of work gloves, a folding knife, a small flashlight, a bottle of water, a change of clothes, 2 prepaid phones, and a spiral notebook. The notebook had names. Dee's name was in it. My name was in it. A bartender named Carolyn from a bar on Toulouse. 2 cocktail servers from a place on Royal. A waitress from a po' boy shop on Decatur who I knew by sight. Hannah's name was not in the notebook because Hannah was new, but there were other women's names with notes next to them. Times, days of the week, notes about how they walked, notes about who walked them home, notes about the side door of Maggie's that opened onto our service alley, which I had not realized was visible from the upstairs window of the building across the alley. He had been working the quarter for at least 8 months. He did not have a fixed address. He was renting a room in a long-term flop on North Rampart by the week, paying cash. The detective said the cap and the jacket and the watch were all bought new in the last year, with cash at 3 different places. The detective said it looked like a person starting over. Starting over is what the detective called it. I do not like that phrase. I think about that phrase more than I want to. A person starts over by getting cleaner clothes and a new haircut and a new town and a new beer he does not drink. A person starts over with a new notebook. The detective told me there had been a kidnapping attempt in Biloxi 6 months earlier. A waitress at a casino bar there had been grabbed in the employee lot at 4 a.m. She had gotten free. She had described a man in a leather jacket and a cap. The description had not been enough to find him then. The detective said they were working with Biloxi to see if there was a match. He would not tell me more than that. He told me one other thing I keep. He said the man's room on North Rampart was on the 3rd floor of an old building that had at some point been a boarding house and was now a chopped-up rental with shared bathrooms and a kitchenette in the hall. The man's room had a window. The window faced an alley. From the window you could see, if you angled right and pressed against the glass, the back service door of Maggie's bar half a block away. The detective said there had been a folding chair set up in front of the window. He said the chair had a worn spot on the seat. Dee left the bar 4 months later. She moved back to her mother's house in Lafayette and finished her degree online. We still text on her birthday and mine. I do not know if the man was the reason she left, or if the man was a thing that happened around the same time she would have left anyway. I have not asked. A few weeks after the arrest, on a Thursday afternoon when I was off, I walked to North Rampart and stood across the street from the building. It was a 2-story brick with a yellow stucco patch where someone had repaired a hole. The 3rd floor was actually a converted attic with 3 windows pushed under the eaves. I counted to the 2nd window from the left, which the detective had said was his. The window had a curtain in it. The curtain was closed. I do not know what I was hoping to see. I had a coffee with me from the place on the corner, and I drank it standing there for maybe 10 minutes. A woman pushing a stroller came out of the front door of the building and gave me a look. I left. Bobby Lee still comes in for his 1 Maker's Mark on Saturdays. He still tips huge. He does not bring up that night. I do not bring it up either. Some things you nod about across the bar without saying. Annie moved back to Atlanta a year after we broke up. Ginsburg, the cat, is still alive. I am still at Maggie's. The cooler door still does not seal right, and I still hear it click through the back wall on slow nights. Last spring I was walking down Royal on my day off, and I passed a man in a faded blue Saints cap, and my whole body went cold before I had a thought in my head. I turned to look. He was a tourist, maybe 60. holding a paper map and asking his wife if Pirates Alley was up or down. They were lost. I helped them. I walked them 2 blocks toward Jackson Square. The wife thanked me. The husband said something about how friendly people were here. I said, yes, ma'am. I said it was a good city for asking. I stood at the corner of Royal and St. Peter watching them walk away, and my hand on the strap of my bag was shaking a little. The cathedral bells rang the hour. Someone was playing a clarinet in front of the cathedral, the same 3 notes over and over. What I think about when I think about it, which is more than I want to, is the moment in the doorway when Hannah looked at me and I could see her face change. The laughing stopped. The crown on her sister's head was still crooked. The brass band was still going down the street. A go-cup hit a curb somewhere behind me and sloshed. And she said thank you twice, and her hand reached for her sister's hand without her looking at her sister. And the 2 of them stood there in the doorway of a bar in the French Quarter at 2 a.m, holding hands like they had as kids. That is the picture I have. Not the cuffs, not the notebook, not the man's face when he turned at St. Louis. Her hand finding her sister's hand without looking. The bar door behind them closing slow on the music inside. The cooler at Maggie's clicking, 2 blocks away, where my back was turned. The folding chair in the room across the alley. The worn spot on the seat